Before the pharaohs, long before the pyramids pierced the sky, before the pharaohs wore their crowns, before anyone even thought to carve a hieroglyph into stone, the land we call Egypt was a very different place. Picture this. The Sahara wasn't a desert. It was green. Grasslands stretched across North Africa, dotted with lakes and rivers, home to herds of gazelles and ancient cattle. People lived there, not in cities, but in small groups, hunting, gathering, figuring out this whole civilization thing, one step at a time. This was around 10,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries. The climate was wetter, kinder, but then slowly the rains stopped coming. The grasslands turned brown, then yellow, then to dust. The lakes dried up. The animals moved on or died out. And the people, well, they had a choice, leave or adapt. Many of them chose to follow the water. And in North Africa, if you're following water, there's really only one place to go, the Nile River. The Nile became everything. It was the lifeline, the highway, the calendar, the reason Egypt could exist at all. Every year, like clockwork, the river would flood. Not a destructive, angry flood, but a gentle, generous one that left behind rich black silt. This silt was pure magic for farming. You didn't need to be a genius to figure out that if you planted seeds in that dark soil, good things would happen. And so around 5000 BCE, people started settling down along the riverbanks in more permanent ways. These early settlers weren't Egyptians yet, not in the way we think of them. They were just communities, villages really, scattered up and down the Nile. They grew barley and wheat, they raised cattle and goats, they made pottery, some of it quite beautiful, decorated with geometric patterns and images of hippos and crocodiles, because apparently even back then, people thought it was a good idea to put dangerous animals on their dinnerware. They buried their dead in simple graves, often in a fetal position, as if sleeping. Sometimes they'd include a few items, a pot, a comb, maybe a favourite tool, nothing fancy, just the essentials for whatever came next. These burials tell us something important. These people believed in an afterlife. They thought death wasn't the end. That idea, that belief, would become one of the defining features of Egyptian civilization. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Around 4000 BCE, things started to change. Villages grew into towns. Towns developed hierarchies. Some people had more stuff than others. Graves got fancier. Instead of a simple pit, you'd get a burial chamber. Instead of one pot, you'd get 10. Social classes were forming, and with them came the need for organization, for leaders, for rules. Two distinct cultures emerged along the Nile. In the south, in Upper Egypt, the region was drier, more isolated, centered around the city of Nekhen. In the north, in Lower Egypt, the land was wetter, more fertile, dominated by the Nile Delta. Yes, Upper Egypt is in the south. Geography can be confusing when you name things based on the river's flow rather than a compass. The Nile flows north, so the upstream part became Upper Egypt. Logic, ancient style. These two regions had their own traditions, their own gods, their own pottery styles. Upper Egypt favoured red pottery with black tops. Lower Egypt preferred red on buff. Thrilling stuff, I know, but archaeologists get very excited about pottery because it's basically ancient people leaving clues about who they were and what they cared about. Trade routes developed. People from Upper Egypt would travel north with goods. People from Lower Egypt would head south. Ideas were exchanged along with merchandise. And with ideas came ambition. Someone somewhere looked at the patchwork of villages and towns and thought, what if we could unify all of this? What if instead of dozens of small leaders, there was one king? That's where things get interesting. Because around 3100 BCE, someone did exactly that. The stories say his name was Narmer, though some call him Menes. He might have been one person, or two people whose legends got tangled together over time. History at this distance gets blurry. But what matters is this. Upper and Lower Egypt were unified. The two lands became one. And with that unification came the birth of something unprecedented. The Egyptian state, the age of the pharaohs, was about to begin. But before we meet the first dynasty properly, it's worth sitting with this moment. Everything that would follow, the pyramids, the temples, the golden masks, the elaborate tombs, all of it grew from these humble beginnings. From people who followed a river when the world turned dry, from farmers who planted seeds in black mud, from communities who buried their dead with care and hoped for something beyond the grave. Egypt didn't spring fully formed from the desert. It grew, slowly, organically from necessity and innovation and the simple human desire to build something that lasts. And soon, those desires would reach heights no one had ever imagined. The first dynasty emerges. So Egypt was unified. Upper and Lower Egypt, the two lands brought together under one ruler. This wasn't just a political merger like two companies shaking hands and sharing a logo. This was the foundation of something that would last for 3,000 years. 3,000? That's longer than the entire span from ancient Rome to now. Let that sink in while you're drifting off. The first pharaoh, whether you call him Nama or Menes, needed to make a statement. Unifying a country is one thing, keeping it unified is another. So he did what any ambitious ruler would do. He built a new capital. The city was called Memphis, located right at the border between Upper and Lower Egypt, where the Nile Valley meets the Delta. Strategic, symbolic, and conveniently central for keeping an eye on both regions. The ancient Egyptians understood real estate. Memphis would remain important for centuries, but what really mattered in those early days was establishing legitimacy. How do you convince thousands of people spread across hundreds of miles that you're not just another local chief, but the king of everything? You create symbols, you develop rituals, you make yourself divine. Enter the concept of the pharaoh as a god-king, not just a ruler but a living deity, the embodiment of Horus, the falcon god. When the pharaoh died, he became Osiris, the god of the afterlife, and the new pharaoh became Horus. It was a tidy system that made succession feel cosmically inevitable rather than politically negotiable. Clever, really. Hard to stage a coup against someone who's literally a god. The first dynasty consisted of 8 kings, though the exact names and order get a bit fuzzy depending on which ancient list you're reading. After Nama came Aha, then Jur, then Jet, and so on. These names might not mean much to us now, but each of these rulers was building the infrastructure, both physical and ideological, that would define Egypt. They developed the royal burial customs. Early pharaohs were buried in elaborate tombs at Abydos in Upper Egypt. These weren't pyramids yet, just large rectangular structures called mastabas, from the Arabic word for bench, because that's essentially what they looked like. Flat-topped, mud brick structures that sat heavily on the desert sand. Inside, burial chambers were stocked with everything a dead king might need: food, furniture, tools, weapons, and unfortunately for them, servants. Yes, servants. In the earliest dynasties, when a pharaoh died, members of his household were sometimes killed and buried nearby. Dozens of subsidiary graves surrounded the royal tomb. This practice, called retainer sacrifice, was probably meant to ensure the king had his entourage in the afterlife. It was also deeply unpleasant for the retainers. Fortunately, this particular tradition didn't last long. Eventually, the Egyptians realized they could just bury statues and images of servants instead. Much more economical and significantly less murdery. The first dynasty also saw the development of hieroglyphic writing. The earliest hieroglyphs are simple, more like labels than literature. A picture of a fish means fish. A picture of a bird means bird. But gradually the system grew more complex. Some symbols represented sounds instead of things. You could combine them to spell out words that didn't have obvious pictures. It was the beginning of one of history's most beautiful and baffling writing systems. Scribes would spend years learning it, and even then, only a tiny percentage of the population could read and write. Knowledge was power, and the scribes held the keys. Administration was everything in early Egypt. The Nile Valley is long and narrow, stretching over 600 miles from the first cataract to the Mediterranean Sea, governing that required organization. The pharaoh couldn't be everywhere at once, so officials were appointed governors for different regions called nomes, tax collectors because civilization runs on revenue, overseers for building projects, scribes to record it all. Bureaucracy was born, and it was glorious, or tedious, probably both. Trade expanded during the first dynasty. Egyptians weren't isolated. They traded with Nubia to the south, bringing back gold, ivory, and ebony. They traded with the Levant to the northeast, acquiring cedar wood and oils. They even had contact with Mesopotamia, though whether through direct trade or intermediaries is still debated. Either way, Egypt was plugged into a wider world, absorbing ideas and technologies while developing its own unique culture. Art became more sophisticated. Carved ivory tags, ceremonial palettes, decorative knife handles all showed increasing skill. The famous Narmer palette, which depicts the unification of Egypt, is a masterpiece of symbolic storytelling. On one side, the king wears the white crown of Upper Egypt and strikes down an enemy. On the other side, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt and inspects decapitated foes. Subtle it was not, but it communicated power, victory, and divine authority. Sometimes you don't need subtlety when you're founding a dynasty. By the end of the first dynasty, Egypt had its shape. The governmental structures, the religious framework, the artistic conventions, the writing system, all the pieces were in place. The next step would be to build something that would quite literally reach for the sky. But first, the second dynasty would have to navigate some turbulence, some forgotten conflicts before Egypt could truly shine. And shine it would. The age of the pyramid builders. The third dynasty arrived, and with it came a man named Djoser. He was a pharaoh, sure, but what really matters for our story is the person standing beside him. His name was Imhotep, and he was about to change architecture forever. No pressure. Before Djoser, royal tombs were those flat-topped mastabas we mentioned earlier. Solid structures, functional but not exactly inspiring. They sat on the ground like very expensive sheds. Imhotep looked at these and thought, what if we went up instead of out? What if we stacked mastabas on top of each other, each one smaller than the last, creating a giant stone stairway to heaven? And so around 2670 BCE, the step pyramid at Saqqara was born. It rose in 6 distinct steps, about 200 feet tall, dominating the landscape in a way nothing had before. This wasn't just a tomb anymore. It was a statement, a monument, a middle finger to mortality itself. And it was built entirely of stone, not mud brick. Stone lasts, stone says. I was here, and I'm not going anywhere. Imhotep wasn't just an architect. He was also a physician, a priest, a poet, and apparently had enough time left over to become a legend. Centuries after his death, Egyptians worshipped him as a god of medicine and wisdom. Not bad for someone who started out as a royal advisor. His step pyramid complex included temples, courtyards, and underground chambers stretching for miles. It was a city for the dead, and it set the template for everything that followed. The fourth dynasty took Imhotep's idea and ran with it. Actually, they perfected it. This is when Egypt entered its golden age of pyramid construction, and honestly, they peaked early. The 3 great pyramids at Giza, the ones everyone thinks of when they hear the word pyramid, all come from this period. Smooth-sided, geometrically perfect, absurdly ambitious. The Egyptians looked at the step pyramid and said, that's cute, but what if we made it smooth? What if we made it huge? What if we made it impossible? The first major smooth-sided pyramid was built by Sneferu, founder of the 4th dynasty. Actually, Sneferu built 3 pyramids, because apparently one wasn't enough to contain his ambition. The first, at Medum, partially collapsed. Awkward. The second, the bent pyramid at Dashur, had to change its angle halfway up because the original angle was too steep and the whole thing started showing stress fractures. You can still see where they adjusted the slope, giving it a distinctive bent appearance. Trial and error on a monumental scale. But Sneferu's third attempt, the Red Pyramid, also at Dashur, got it right. Smooth sides, stable structure, proper angle. It was the first true smooth-sided pyramid, and it worked. Sneferu could finally rest in peace, knowing he'd figured it out. Or rather, his architects and workers figured it out, while he took the credit. Leadership in action. This period, the 4th dynasty, represents the absolute peak of pyramid construction technology. The pyramids got bigger, more precise, more ambitious. The workforce was enormous. Tens of thousands of people, labourers, craftsmen, engineers, all working in coordinated shifts. Recent archaeology suggests these weren't slaves, despite what old movies told us. They were paid workers, fed and housed in workers' villages, with evidence of medical care and proper burials. Still back-breaking work, still dangerous, but not the whip-cracking slave narrative Hollywood sold us. These workers quarried massive limestone blocks, some weighing as much as 15 tons. They transported them using sledges, ropes, and probably a lot of swearing. They developed ramps, either straight, zigzagging, or spiral, to haul the blocks up the pyramid as it grew. The exact method is still debated, because the Egyptians didn't leave us an instruction manual. Rude of them, really. The precision is staggering. The bases of these pyramids are almost perfectly level, with deviations of less than an inch across hundreds of feet. The sides align almost exactly with the cardinal directions: north, south, east, west. They didn't have compasses, they used the stars, the sun, careful observation and mathematics. They were astronomers, geometers and engineers armed with copper tools and an apparently limitless supply of determination. Why pyramids? Why this shape? The pyramid form was symbolic. It represented the primordial mound, the first land that emerged from the waters of chaos at the creation of the world. It was also a ramp, a stairway for the pharaoh's soul to ascend to the sky and join the sun god Ra, form and function, wrapped in theology. The pyramid complexes weren't just tombs. Each included a mortuary temple, a causeway, a valley temple, and smaller pyramids for queens. They were elaborate ritual centers where priests would perform daily offerings for the deceased pharaoh forever, or at least until the money ran out and the dynasty collapsed. Forever is expensive. The fourth dynasty burned bright and fast. These massive building projects required enormous resources, centralized control, and probably exhausted the economy, but they created monuments that would outlast empires, religions, and languages. When Greek tourists visited Egypt over 2,000 years later, these pyramids were already ancient wonders, and the greatest of them all was still to come. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops, looked at his father's accomplishments and thought, "I can do bigger," and he did. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built around 2560 BCE, is the largest pyramid ever constructed in Egypt. It held the record as the tallest human-made structure in the world for over 3,800 years. Not a bad legacy for someone whose mummy we've never actually found. The numbers are absurd. The pyramid originally stood at 481 feet tall, though it's lost about 30 feet over the millennia due to erosion and people stealing the outer casing stones. The base covers 13 acres. That's roughly the size of 7 city blocks. It contains an estimated 2,300,000 stone blocks, each averaging 2.5 tons. Some of the granite blocks in the internal chambers weigh up to 80 tons. Those came from Aswan, over 500 miles south. Someone had to get those blocks onto boats, float them down the Nile, unload them, and then somehow incorporate them into the pyramid's interior. The logistics make modern project managers weep. The pyramid was originally covered in smooth white limestone casing stones, polished to a shine. When the sun hit it, the entire structure would gleam like a beacon across the desert. It must have been absolutely blinding, visible for miles. A statement of power that needed no words. Unfortunately, most of those casing stones were stripped away over the centuries, carted off to build medieval Cairo. Recycling, Ancient Monument Edition. The interior of the Great Pyramid is where things get interesting. There are 3 main chambers. The lowest is carved into the bedrock beneath the pyramid, unfinished and mysterious. The middle chamber is called the Queen's Chamber, though no queen was ever buried there. The name is a misnomer from Arab explorers centuries later. And then there's the King's Chamber, the actual burial room, sitting near the center of the pyramid's mass. To reach the King's Chamber, you ascend through the Grand Gallery, a corbelled passage that rises at a steep angle, with a ceiling that soars 28 feet high. Walking through it even today is an experience. The stone walls close in on either side, the passage stretches ahead and up, and you're struck by the realization that this was carved and built 4,500 years ago. The precision is unsettling. The blocks fit together so tightly that you can't slip a piece of paper between them. Inside the King's Chamber sits a red granite sarcophagus. Empty. Always has been, at least by the time anyone in recorded history entered the pyramid. No lid, no body, no treasure. Either it was robbed in antiquity, which is likely, or Khufu was never actually buried there, which is less likely but can't be ruled out. Mysteries upon mysteries. The pyramid was sealed with elaborate blocking systems. Granite plugs were slid into place in the ascending passage. Massive stones designed to prevent anyone from reaching the burial chambers. Clearly they didn't work. Grave robbers are persistent, creative, and have no respect for architectural marvels. By the time the Arab Caliph al-Ma'mun tunneled into the pyramid in the 9th century CE, boring a hole through the limestone because he couldn't find the original entrance, the interior had already been plundered. Building the Great Pyramid took about 20 years according to most estimates. Herodotus, the Greek historian, claimed 100,000 workers toiled for 3 months a year during the flood season, when farming was impossible. Modern scholars think the number was smaller, maybe 20,000 to 30,000, working year-round in rotating crews. Either way, it was a massive undertaking that required feeding, housing, and organising an army of labourers. Recent discoveries of workers' villages near the pyramids show us what life was like for the people who built these monuments. They lived in barracks, ate bread, beer and meat, lots of meat, which was unusual for common people. Cattle bones found in the workers' village suggest they were consuming 11 cattle and 23 sheep per day. That's a lot of protein. Building pyramids is hungry work. These workers also received medical care. Skeletons show evidence of healed fractures, some with signs of surgical intervention. A man whose arm was amputated and who lived for years afterward. Someone cared enough to keep him alive and fed even after he could no longer work. It complicates the narrative. These weren't faceless slaves under the lash. They were people, with families, with communities, participating in something they believed mattered. Why did they do it? National pride, religious devotion, economic necessity, probably all of the above. Building the pyramid provided employment, food and purpose. It was a public works project on an unimaginable scale, and it unified the country under a single goal, making sure their god-king had the most impressive tomb possible. The Great Pyramid has inspired awe, theories, and no small amount of nonsense for millennia. Some claim it encodes mathematical constants or predicts the future. It doesn't. It's just an extremely well-built tomb constructed by skilled workers with copper tools, wooden sledges, and an impressive understanding of geometry. But standing before it, even now, you understand why people invent stories. Some things are too magnificent to accept as merely human achievement. Yet human achievement is exactly what it was. Life along the Nile. While pharaohs were busy building monuments to themselves, most Egyptians were concerned with more practical matters, like not starving, like keeping their homes from washing away, like convincing their neighbours that no, that goat really did belong to them first. Daily life along the Nile was a rhythm dictated by the river, the seasons and the harvest. The Egyptian year, divided into 3 seasons, each 4 months long. First came Akhenaten, the inundation, when the Nile flooded and covered the fields with water and silt. Then Peret, the growing season, when farmers planted and tended their crops. Finally Shemu, the harvest, when everyone worked frantically to gather everything before the next flood arrived. This cycle repeated without fail, year after year, century after century. The Nile was reliable in a way few rivers are. It made Egypt possible. Most Egyptians were farmers. They lived in small mud brick houses clustered in villages along the riverbank. These homes were simple, practical, designed to stay cool in the brutal heat. Flat roofs where people could sleep on summer nights when the indoors became an oven. Small windows to keep out the sun. Floors made of packed earth. Not luxurious but functional. The wealthy had larger houses with multiple rooms, courtyards, even gardens, but the basic design was the same. Mud brick, thick walls, and a prayer that the annual flood didn't reach quite this far. Furniture was minimal. Most people sat on mats or low stools. The wealthy had chairs and beds, but even those were simpler than you'd imagine. A wooden frame, some rope webbing, maybe a linen cushion if you were fancy. People stored their belongings in baskets and ceramic jars. Closets weren't really a thing. Neither was clutter, mostly because people didn't own much. Food was bread and beer. Seriously, that was the foundation of the Egyptian diet. Bread came in dozens of varieties, made from emmer wheat or barley, baked in clay ovens. Beer was thick, nutritious, only mildly alcoholic, and safer to drink than water. Everyone drank it, men, women, children. It was liquid bread, essentially, and it provided calories and nutrients. Washing down your bread with beer made perfect sense when your other option was Nile water that might contain parasites, bacteria, or crocodile contributions. Beyond bread and beer, people ate onions, garlic, lentils, beans, lettuce, cucumbers, and leeks. Vegetables were plentiful. Fruit too. Dates, figs, grapes, pomegranates. Meat was less common for ordinary people, reserved for special occasions or religious festivals. The wealthy ate beef, goat, duck, and goose regularly. Everyone, rich and poor, ate fish from the Nile, though priests often avoided it for religious reasons. Fish were associated with certain gods and myths, including an unfortunate incident involving Osiris's body parts, but that's a story for later. Clothing was simple and practical. Linen was king. Egypt produced the finest linen in the ancient world, woven from flax grown along the Nile. Men wore kilts or loincloths. Women wore straight-sheath dresses. Both genders went barefoot most of the time, though sandals made of papyrus or leather existed for those who could afford them. The wealthy wore more elaborate clothing, pleated and draped, sometimes so finely woven you could see through it. Fashion existed, even in the Bronze Age. Children ran around naked until puberty, practical in the heat, and it saved on laundry. They played with toys, dolls, balls, spinning tops, board games. Egyptian children played a game called Senet, a strategy game involving moving pieces across a board according to the throw of sticks. Adults played it too. In fact, Senet became so popular it took on religious significance, representing the soul's journey through the afterlife. Leave it to the Egyptians to turn a board game into cosmic metaphor. Education existed, but only for a lucky few. Most children learned their parents' trade. Farmers' sons became farmers. Potters' sons became potters. If you were exceptionally fortunate, and usually from a wealthier family, you might attend a school to become a scribe. Scribes were the literate elite, the administrators who kept the kingdom running. They didn't do manual labor. They didn't get dirty. They sat in the shade with their palettes and papyrus and recorded everything. Tax receipts, grain stores, legal disputes, love poems, medical texts, complaints about lazy workers. Being a scribe meant security, respect, and not having to plough fields in the sun. It was a good gig if you could get it. Women in Egypt had more rights than in many ancient societies. They could own property, conduct business, initiate divorce, and inherit wealth. They couldn't hold most government positions, but within the home and economy they had agency. Some women became priestesses, a few became pharaohs, though that was rare enough to be shocking when it happened. The rhythm of life was communal. Villagers worked together during planting and harvest. Festivals brought everyone together to honor gods, celebrate the flood, or mark the new year. Religion wasn't separate from daily life, it was woven through everything. The blessings spoken over meals, the amulets worn for protection, the offerings left at local shrines. Life was hard, short by modern standards, but not without joy. People laughed, loved, raised families, and watched the Nile rise and fall. The river gave, the river took away, and the river always returned. The Sphinx and Its Secrets. Just east of the Great Pyramid sits something even stranger. A creature with the body of a lion and the face of a human, carved from a single massive outcrop of limestone. The Great Sphinx of Giza. It's enormous, 240 feet long and 66 feet tall, and it's been staring eastward toward the rising sun for thousands of years, silent and enigmatic. Exactly how it prefers things, apparently. Most scholars believe the Sphinx was built during the reign of Khafre, the pharaoh who constructed the second pyramid at Giza, around 2500 BCE. The face is thought to represent Khafre himself, though it's been so eroded over the millennia that we're essentially guessing based on proportions and context. The nose is missing, famously, probably knocked off sometime in the medieval period. No, Napoleon's troops didn't do it, despite the persistent rumour. Drawings from before Napoleon's arrival show the nose already gone. People love blaming the French for things, but this one isn't on them. The Sphinx was carved directly from the bedrock, which is both impressive and problematic. Impressive because it meant chiselling away thousands of tons of limestone to reveal the figure beneath. Problematic because limestone is soft, prone to erosion, especially the lower quality stone layers in the Sphinx's body. The ancient Egyptians knew this. Even in their own time, they had to perform repairs, adding limestone blocks to shore up damaged areas. Why a sphinx? The form was symbolic, representing royal power and divine protection. The lion was the ultimate predator, the king of beasts. giving it a human head, specifically the pharaoh's head, merged human intelligence with animal strength. It was a guardian positioned to protect the pyramids and the sacred necropolis from evil spirits or tomb robbers. How well it worked is debatable, given that most tombs were eventually robbed anyway, but points for effort. For most of its existence, the Sphinx has been buried in sand. The desert reclaims everything given enough time, and the Sphinx sat in the perfect spot to collect drifting dunes. Only the head poked out, a mysterious stone face emerging from the sand, which must have been deeply unsettling for travellers. Several times throughout history, rulers decided to dig it out, clear away the sand and restore it. Then they'd die, the maintenance would stop, and the sand would return. The desert is patient. One of the most famous restorations was undertaken by Thutmose IV, over 1,000 years after the Sphinx was carved. According to a stone stela placed between the Sphinx's paws, Thutmose fell asleep in the creature's shadow while out hunting. The Sphinx appeared to him in a dream, and promised him the throne of Egypt if he would clear away the sand and restore the monument. Thutmose did exactly that, and coincidentally, or perhaps not so coincidentally, he became pharaoh shortly afterward. Divine mandate through dream interpretation, a classic move. The Sphinx has inspired endless speculation and wild theories. Some claim it's far older than the pyramids built by a lost advanced civilization. They point to erosion patterns on the Sphinx's body, suggesting water weathering rather than wind and sand. This would mean it was carved during a wetter period. Thousands of years earlier, mainstream archaeology firmly rejects this, pointing out that the erosion patterns are consistent with rain and groundwater seepage over millennia, not evidence of some prehistoric civilization. Also, there's zero evidence of any culture capable of such a feat existing in Egypt before the dynastic period. But tell that to the people who really want Atlantis to be real. Others have claimed the Sphinx contains hidden chambers, secret tunnels, lost libraries of ancient wisdom. Ground-penetrating radar has found some hollow spaces beneath and around it, which is expected given underground bedrock formations and the complex construction history. But no lost halls of records, no ancient alien blueprints, just limestone and sand and the slow, relentless work of erosion. What we do know is that the Sphinx was once brightly painted. Traces of red pigment remain on the face. The body was likely painted yellow or ochre. It may have worn a ceremonial false beard, fragments of which were found and are now in museums. Imagine it. Not the weathered, sand-blasted grey stone we see today, but a vivid, colourful guardian painted and gleaming under the desert sun. Ancient monuments weren't the austere, monochrome ruins we're used to. They were alive with colour, almost garish by modern tastes. The Sphinx has watched empires rise and fall. It was already ancient when Rome was founded. It was a tourist attraction when Alexander the Great visited. It sat buried to its neck when Napoleon marched past. And it's still here, still staring east, still keeping whatever secrets it has left. People have always projected their own mysteries onto it. They want it to be more than it is, a royal monument, a religious symbol, a product of its time. They want hidden chambers and lost wisdom because the truth that humans 4,500 years ago could create something this magnificent with copper chisels and determination is somehow harder to accept than ancient aliens. But the Sphinx doesn't need conspiracy theories to be remarkable.
It just is.
The Middle Kingdom awakens. After the glory of the pyramid builders, things got messy. The Old Kingdom, that golden age of massive monuments and centralized power, collapsed. The reasons are complicated. Climate change brought drought. The Nile floods weakened, crop yields dropped. The central government, which depended on agricultural surplus to fund its projects and bureaucracy, suddenly found itself broke. Provincial governors, the nomarchs who had been gaining power and wealth for generations, stopped sending taxes to the capital. They declared independence. Egypt fractured into competing territories. This period, called the First Intermediate Period, lasted roughly from 2180 to 2050 BCE. It was chaos. Local rulers fought each other, trade declined, construction stopped. The historical record becomes fragmented, confusing, full of gaps. It wasn't a dark age in the medieval European sense. Civilization didn't collapse, but it was definitely a rough patch. People wrote pessimistic literature about the world falling apart. about social order inverting, about everything their grandparents built crumbling to dust. Fun times. But Egypt is resilient. Slowly, two power centres emerged, one in Heracleopolis in the north, another in Thebes in the south. They fought for control, dynasty against dynasty, until finally, around 2050 BCE, a Theban ruler named Mentuhotep II conquered the north and reunified Egypt. The Middle Kingdom had begun. Mentuhotep II was a military leader first, but he understood that conquest alone doesn't create stability. He restored the administrative systems, re-established trade routes, and launched building projects to signal that Egypt was back in business. His mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahari, built into the cliffs on the west bank at Thebes, was a statement of power and legitimacy. It combined a temple and tomb in a terrace design that would inspire imitators centuries later. The Middle Kingdom wasn't going to build pyramids as massive as the Old Kingdom. Those days were over, but they could still create impressive monuments. The Middle Kingdom is often called Egypt's classical age, the period when art, literature and culture reached a refined peak. It wasn't as flashy as the Pyramid Age, but it was more sophisticated, more introspective. The pharaohs were still divine, still powerful, but they were portrayed more realistically. Statues from this period show rulers with lined faces, heavy expressions, the weight of responsibility visible in stone. They look tired. Being a god-king during a period of recovery and reform probably was exhausting. The 12th dynasty, which followed the 11th, was the peak of the Middle Kingdom. It began with Amenemhat I, who moved the capital north to a new city called Ichitawi, near the Fayoum. Smart move. Thebes was great, full of history and religious significance, but it was far south. A more central location made governing easier. Control the north, maintain loyalty in the south, keep an eye on both. Amenemhat was paranoid, probably with good reason. He'd come to power through political intrigue, possibly a coup, and he knew how the game worked. He wrote a piece of literature, or had it written in his name, called The Instructions of Amenemhat, where he warned his son to trust no one. Siblings will betray you, friends are useless, subordinates plot. Even in your own bed, guard your heart. It's deeply cynical advice. And tragically, Amenemhat was apparently assassinated in a palace conspiracy. Should have trusted his own instructions. His son, Senusret I, took over smoothly, suggesting he was prepared for the transition, possibly even involved in stopping the conspiracy. He ruled for decades, solidified the dynasty, and launched military campaigns into Nubia. Nubia to the south was rich in gold, and Egypt wanted it. The Middle Kingdom established a series of massive mud brick fortresses along the Nile in Nubia, controlling trade routes and access to resources. These fortresses were engineering marvels, with thick walls, defensive towers, and complex gate systems. They weren't just military outposts, they were statements. Egypt is here, Egypt is strong, and Egypt isn't leaving. The Middle Kingdom also saw Egypt expanding influence to the northeast, into the Levant and Sinai. Trade flourished. Egyptian objects appear in archaeological sites across the eastern Mediterranean. Foreign goods flowed into Egypt. Timber from Lebanon, olive oil, wine, silver. Egypt was wealthy again, connected to the wider world, confident. Literature thrived during this period. The Egyptians wrote stories, not just religious texts or administrative records, but actual narratives with characters and plots. They wrote wisdom literature, teaching texts about how to live a good life, how to serve the king, how to advance in your career. They wrote love poems, because apparently even in the Bronze Age, people enjoyed reading about romance and longing. Human nature doesn't change much. Religion evolved too. Osiris, the god of the afterlife, became increasingly important. In the Old Kingdom, only the pharaoh had a guaranteed afterlife. By the Middle Kingdom, anyone who could afford the proper burial and knew the right spells could hope for eternal life. Democratization of the afterlife. Death became less exclusive. The Middle Kingdom represented Egypt finding itself again after crisis. Not as grandiose as before, but wiser, more mature. Though of course, trouble was always waiting just over the horizon. Tales of Sinuhe and Egyptian literature. The ancient Egyptians were storytellers. They didn't just record tax receipts and royal propaganda, though they did plenty of that too. They wrote stories meant to entertain. to teach, to move the heart. And the greatest story to survive from the Middle Kingdom, perhaps the greatest piece of Egyptian literature period, is the tale of Sinuhe. Sinuhe was a court official during the reign of Amenemhat I. When the old pharaoh died, Sinuhe overheard something. The text never quite tells us what, something about the succession or a conspiracy, and he panicked. He fled Egypt, not a planned escape, but a terrified sprint into the desert, convinced he was about to be caught up in political violence. He ran east into the Sinai, then further into the Levant, into what we'd now call Syria and Palestine. The story follows Sinuhe as he becomes a refugee, wandering foreign lands, separated from everything he knew. He's taken in by a Bedouin chief, marries the chief's daughter, becomes a successful warrior and leader in this foreign land. He has children, he grows wealthy. By all external measures, he's thriving, but inside, he's miserable, he's homesick. He dreams of Egypt. He wants to die on Egyptian soil, to be buried properly, to have the correct rituals performed so his soul can reach the afterlife. Years pass, decades. Then one day, a letter arrives from the new pharaoh, Senusret I. The king has heard of Senusret's plight and offers him pardon, invites him to return home, to live out his days in Egypt and be buried as an Egyptian should be. Senusret's overwhelmed. He writes back immediately, accepts, and begins the long journey home. The descriptions of his return are beautiful. He's restored to the court, given fine clothes, a position, a tomb prepared near the royal pyramid complex. The text describes how he's bathed, perfumed, dressed in linen, transformed from the desert wanderer back into an Egyptian nobleman. It's a rebirth. He will die in Egypt as he always wanted, and his soul will be safe. Why did this story resonate so deeply with ancient Egyptians? It was copied and recopied for centuries. Students practiced their hieratic script by transcribing it. It appears on papyri, on pottery shards called ostraka in tombs. People loved this story, perhaps because it dealt with universal themes, exile and homecoming, identity and belonging, the fear of dying away from home, or perhaps because it reinforced Egyptian values, the importance of proper burial, loyalty to the pharaoh, the belief that Egypt was the center of the world and anywhere else was just a lesser place where you waited until you could go home. Sinuhe's fear wasn't death itself, but dying improperly, without the rituals. To the Egyptians, that was true death. Oblivion. The soul lost forever. The story offered reassurance. Even if you wander far, even if circumstances tear you away, you can still come home. You can still be saved. Other Middle Kingdom literature explored different themes. The Eloquent Peasant told of a poor farmer who was robbed and through a series of beautifully crafted speeches appealing for justice, eventually won compensation and recognition from the pharaoh. It was a story about the power of words, about justice prevailing, and about speaking truth even when you're powerless. The peasant's speeches are rhetorical masterpieces, full of metaphors and clever arguments. The officials listening to him were so impressed they kept delaying judgment just to hear him speak more. It's basically a story about how good rhetoric can save you, which is very on brand for a civilization that worshipped scribes. Then there was The Shipwrecked Sailor, a tale about a sailor who survived a storm and washed up on a magical island inhabited by a giant talking serpent covered in gold and lapis lazuli. The serpent told the sailor his own story of loss and survival, then prophesied the sailor's rescue and sent him home with treasures. It's part adventure story, part philosophical reflection on fate and loss. Also, giant talking snake. Egyptian literature could get weird. Wisdom texts were popular too. The instructions of Ptahhotep offered advice on how to live well. Be humble, listen to others, don't be arrogant, serve your superiors faithfully, be kind to your inferiors. It's pragmatic wisdom aimed at young men trying to advance in the bureaucracy. How to behave at dinner parties, how to speak to your boss, how to avoid making enemies. Life advice, Bronze Age edition. Love poetry from this period is surprisingly relatable. Young men and women pining for each other, describing their beloved's beauty, lamenting separation, celebrating union. The imagery is vivid, comparisons to flowers, to birds, to precious materials. The emotions are timeless. Longing, desire, joy, heartbreak. Turns out people in 2000 BCE felt the same things we do. Egyptian literature shows us that these weren't just ancient builders of monuments. They were people with inner lives, with emotions and fears and hopes. They questioned things. They told stories to make sense of the world. They wrote down their thoughts and feelings, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And 4,000 years later, we're still reading them, still moved by Sinuhe's homesickness, still nodding along to Ptahhotep's advice. Some things really don't change. The Hyksos Invasion. The Middle Kingdom eventually did what all kingdoms do. It declined. The 13th dynasty was weak, fragmented, a parade of short-reigned pharaohs who couldn't maintain control. The central government lost its grip. The provinces drifted into semi-independence again. And then, around 1650 BCE, something unprecedented happened. Foreigners took control of Egypt, not through gradual cultural infiltration, but through military conquest and political takeover. The Hyksos had arrived. The name Hyksos comes from the Egyptian term Hyksos, meaning rulers of foreign lands. They weren't a single ethnic group, but rather a collection of peoples from the Levant, modern-day Syria, Palestine and Lebanon, who had been migrating into the eastern Nile Delta for generations. At first they came peacefully, settling in communities, trading, integrating. But as Egypt weakened, these communities grew stronger, more organized, more ambitious. Eventually they established their own dynasty, the 15th dynasty, ruling from their capital at Avaris in the Delta. The Egyptians hated this. Their national identity was built on the idea that Egypt was special, divinely protected, superior to the chaotic foreign lands beyond their borders. Having foreigners ruling Egypt was a cosmic insult, a violation of the natural order. Later Egyptian texts describe the Hyksos period as a time of horror and destruction, claiming the invaders burned cities, destroyed temples and oppressed the people. Standard propaganda from the victors who eventually expelled them, but the reality was probably more complicated. Archaeological evidence suggests the Hyksos didn't destroy Egyptian culture. They actually adopted it. They used Egyptian titles, wrote in hieroglyphs, worshipped Egyptian gods alongside their own deities. They ruled like pharaohs because they wanted to be pharaohs. This wasn't a barbarian horde pillaging for loot. It was a foreign dynasty trying to legitimize itself within Egyptian tradition. They just happened to bring some new technology with them. The Hyksos introduced the horse and chariot to Egypt. Before them, Egyptians travelled on foot or by boat. The idea of harnessing horses to two-wheeled chariots for warfare was revolutionary. Chariots provided speed, mobility, and psychological impact. Imagine being an Egyptian infantry soldier used to fighting other infantry, when suddenly a line of chariots comes thundering across the battlefield. Terrifying. The Hyksos also brought improved bronze-working techniques, composite bows, and new military strategies. They had a technological edge. But they didn't control all of Egypt. The Hyksos ruled the Delta and much of Lower Egypt. But Upper Egypt remained independent under a native Egyptian dynasty based in Thebes, the 17th dynasty. For decades, an uneasy coexistence persisted. The Thebans paid tribute, avoided conflict, and quietly seethed. Then, around 1550 BCE, one Theban ruler decided enough was enough. His name was Sekhonenptah. His mummy tells a violent story. His skull shows multiple traumatic wounds, blows from an axe, a dagger, a mace. He died in battle, probably fighting the Hyksos, and died badly. His body was hastily mummified, suggesting he fell far from home and his followers had to preserve him quickly in difficult circumstances. But his death wasn't in vain. He started something. His son Thutmose continued the fight. We have a record of Thutmose's campaigns, texts describing his fury at the Hyksos' presence. He railed against the humiliation of sharing Egypt with foreigners, of having a Hyksos king in Avaris and a Nubian chief to the south, with himself squeezed between them. He launched aggressive military campaigns north, attacking Hyksos positions, pushing toward the Delta. He didn't live long enough to finish the job. He died young, possibly also in battle. But his brother, Ahmose I, completed what the family started. Ahmose besieged Avaris, the Hyksos capital, in a prolonged campaign that must have been brutal. Eventually the city fell. The Hyksos were expelled, driven back into the Levant. Ahmose pursued them, launching military expeditions into Canaan to ensure they wouldn't return. He reunified Egypt under native rule. The second intermediate period was over. The new kingdom had begun. The Hyksos period traumatized the Egyptian psyche. For generations afterward, texts described them as enemies of the gods, as agents of chaos. The expulsion became a foundational myth. Egypt victorious over foreign invaders, the natural order restored. But the trauma also changed Egypt fundamentally. The Egyptians learned that isolation wasn't safety, that foreign threats were real and could succeed, that technology mattered, that military strength was essential. The new kingdom would be different from what came before. More militaristic, more imperial, more outward-looking. Egypt would conquer, not just defend. It would build an empire, projecting power into Nubia and the Levant, creating buffer zones, ensuring that never again would foreigners march into the delta and claim the throne. The Hyksos invasion was a crisis, a national humiliation, but it forged Egypt into something harder, sharper, more ambitious. The age of pyramid-building introspection was over. The age of empire was about to begin. Egyptian medicine and magic. The ancient Egyptians were surprisingly advanced in medicine, considering they thought the heart did the thinking and the brain was useless packing material. They performed surgery, set broken bones, treated infections, diagnosed diseases, and wrote detailed medical texts that show both practical knowledge and complete misunderstandings of human anatomy. It was a fascinating mix of empirical observation and magical thinking, and honestly, the magic probably helped as much as the medicine in some cases. Belief is powerful. Medical texts survive on papyri, the most famous being the Edwin Smith Papyrus and the Ebers Papyrus. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to around 1600 BCE but probably copied from much older sources, is remarkably rational. It describes 48 surgical cases, organized from head to toe, skull fractures, broken noses, dislocated jaws, spinal injuries, chest wounds. For each case, the text gives examination procedures, diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment. The language is clinical, almost modern. If you examine a man with a gaping wound in his head, penetrating to the bone, you should palpate the wound. If you find his skull cracked, you should say, "An ailment I will treat." But if the brain is exposed, you should say, "An ailment not to be treated." The honesty is refreshing. Ancient doctors knew their limits and weren't afraid to admit when cases were hopeless. Treatment for treatable injuries was practical. Clean the wound, stitch it with linen thread if necessary. Apply honey as an antiseptic, because honey actually has antibacterial properties. Cover with bandages. Immobilize broken bones with splints made from wood and linen, stiffened with resin. These techniques worked. Mummies show evidence of healed fractures, successful amputations, even dental work. Egyptian doctors were skilled. But then there's the Ebers Papyrus, which is where things get weird. It's a collection of over 800 remedies for various ailments. And while some are sensible, others are deeply strange. Treatments include ingredients like honey, dates, beer, figs, oils, minerals, and medicinal plants. Reasonable so far, but also crushed beetles, lizard blood, mouse tails, human excrement, crocodile dung. The logic behind some of these choices is lost to time, though sympathetic magic probably played a role, like cures like, or something that disgusts demons might drive away disease. Many remedies were administered with spells. The physician would recite incantations while preparing medicine, invoking gods for healing. Isis was a popular choice, she who had healed Horus after Set attacked him. Sekhmet, despite being a goddess of plague, could also cure diseases she'd sent. Medicine and magic were inseparable. A broken bone got splinted, obviously, but also blessed. An infection got cleaned and dressed, but also warded against demons causing the fever. The Egyptians understood that the body had channels, vessels they called metu that carried blood, air, water, and other fluids. They observed that the heartbeat and that pulse could be felt in various parts of the body. They connected the heart to the vessels, correctly identifying the circulatory system's center, but they thought the heart controlled thought and emotion, while the brain was irrelevant. When mummifying, they threw the brain away but carefully preserved the heart. Priorities were slightly off. They also believed that many diseases came from wekadu, harmful substances that entered the body through bad air, spoiled food, or demonic influence. Some of these ideas align with germ theory if you squint. Spoiled food does cause disease. Bad air, miasma theory, was wrong, but not absurdly so. Demons causing illness is less scientific, but if you're pre-microscope, blaming invisible malevolent entities isn't that different from blaming invisible microbes.
Dentistry existed.
Tooth decay was common because ancient Egyptian bread contained grit from stone grinding wheels, wearing down enamel and causing abscesses. Dental treatments included drilling abscesses to drain infection, filling cavities with various mixtures, and extracting rotten teeth. Some mummies have evidence of crude dental work, holes drilled into the jaw to relieve pressure. It must have been agonizing, but better than dying from an abscess that spreads to the brain. Eye problems were frequent. The bright sun, blowing sand, and parasites caused infections, cataracts, and blindness. Eye medicine was a specialty. Doctors used copper-based compounds to treat infections which actually have antimicrobial properties. They also used kohl, black eye makeup, which reduced glare and had medicinal ingredients. Fashion and function combined. Contraception was attempted. Texts describe pessaries made from crocodile dung, honey, or acacia gum inserted before intercourse. Did they work? Honey and acacia create an acidic environment that might have mild spermicidal effects. Crocodile dung probably just functioned as a barrier, if it did anything at all. Points for trying, at least. Pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous. Magic played a huge role. Pregnant women wore amulets, recited spells, invoked protective deities. Midwives assisted births, sometimes using techniques like squatting positions and massage. If complications arose, prayers intensified. If the mother or child died, which happened often, it was the will of the gods. Mental illness wasn't understood as medical. Depression, anxiety, psychosis were attributed to demonic possession or divine punishment. Treatments involved exorcism, prayers, and amulets more than medicine. The Egyptians couldn't see the mind as part of the body requiring treatment. The brain, after all, was useless. Still, Egyptian medicine advanced beyond many contemporaries. Doctors specialized: eyes, stomach, teeth, surgery. They trained apprentices, recorded knowledge, shared techniques, and when medicine failed, they had magic. Sometimes that was enough. The new kingdom rises. Ahmose I didn't just expel the Hyksos and call it a day. He understood that defense required offense, that security meant controlling the borders and the lands beyond them. So he reorganized the military, incorporating those chariot technologies the Hyksos had introduced, training Egyptian soldiers in new tactics, creating a professional standing army. No more relying on conscripted farmers during downtime between harvests. Egypt now had career soldiers, men who trained year-round, who made war their profession. He also established the 18th dynasty, which would become one of the most powerful and famous royal lines in Egyptian history. This dynasty would produce legendary pharaohs: Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, names that still resonate thousands of years later. But it started with Ahmose, the liberator, the unifier, the man who transformed national trauma into national purpose. The capital remained at Thebes, in Upper Egypt. Thebes had been the center of resistance against the Hyksos, and now it became the heart of the empire. The local god of Thebes, Amun, rose to prominence alongside the dynasty. Amun merged with Ra, the ancient sun god, becoming Amun-Ra, king of the gods. The priests of Amun grew wealthy and powerful as grateful pharaohs showered them with donations and land grants. Temples expanded. Thebes became magnificent, a city of gods and kings. After Ahmose came Amenhotep I, then Thutmose I, and it was Thutmose who really set the imperial template. He wasn't content with securing Egypt's borders. He wanted to dominate them. He launched campaigns deep into Nubia, extending Egyptian control far south beyond the traditional frontiers. He erected a stela, a stone marker at the third cataract of the Nile, boasting of his conquests. Then he turned north and invaded the Levant, marching his armies into Syria, all the way to the Euphrates River. No pharaoh had ever pushed Egyptian power that far. It was a statement. Egypt wasn't just defending itself. Egypt was a superpower. These campaigns brought wealth flooding back to Egypt. Gold from Nubia, tribute from conquered cities in the Levant. Prisoners of war brought back as labourers. The new kingdom was rich in a way the Middle Kingdom had never been, and wealth meant building. Temples rose across Egypt. each pharaoh trying to outdo their predecessors. The Temple of Karnak at Thebes began its long expansion, eventually becoming the largest religious complex in the ancient world, a sprawling maze of pylons, courtyards, obelisks, and sanctuaries that grew for over 1,000 years. The New Kingdom also changed how pharaohs were buried. No more pyramids. Pyramids were landmarks, advertisements that screamed treasure here, and they'd all been robbed. Every single one. The New Kingdom pharaohs wanted security, secrecy. So they chose a remote desert valley on the west bank of the Nile, across from Thebes, a place where limestone cliffs rose stark and forbidding. They carved their tombs deep into the rock, hidden entrances sealed and disguised. The Valley of the Kings was born. These rock-cut tombs were decorated with elaborate paintings and texts, guidebooks for the afterlife. The walls showed the pharaoh's journey through the underworld, the challenges faced, the gods encountered, the spells needed to navigate the dangers and reach eternal life. The Book of the Dead, the Book of Gates, the Book of Caverns, all these religious texts were painted in vivid colours on tomb walls, turning burial chambers into sacred spaces that merged art, religion and literature. Meanwhile, mortuary temples were built separately away from the tombs, on the edge of the cultivation where priests could perform daily rituals for the deceased pharaoh. This separation of tomb and temple was practical. The temples could be grand and public, honouring the king's memory, while the actual burial remained secret. In theory, tomb robbers are resourceful. Egyptian society in the New Kingdom was complex and stratified. At the top sat the pharaoh, divine and absolute. Below him a vast bureaucracy, viziers who ran the government, generals who commanded armies, high priests who managed temples, governors who administered provinces. Then came the scribes, the accountants and administrators who kept records of everything. Below them, craftsmen, merchants, farmers, labourers, and at the bottom, slaves and prisoners of war. Though slavery in Egypt was different from later Greek or Roman models. Slaves could own property, marry free people, even buy their freedom in some cases. Women still retained significant rights. They could own and manage property, conduct business, serve as priestesses in temples. A few exceptional women would even seize the throne itself, ruling as pharaohs in their own right. The New Kingdom was patriarchal, no question, but women weren't entirely powerless within its structures. International diplomacy became important. Egypt wasn't isolated anymore. It was part of a network of great powers. The Hittites in Anatolia, the Mitanni in Syria, the Kassites in Babylon, the Mycenaeans in Greece. They sent ambassadors, negotiated treaties, arranged royal marriages, traded gifts. The Amuletters, a cache of diplomatic correspondence found later, reveal a world of international relations surprisingly similar to modern diplomacy. Kings addressed each other as brothers, complained about late deliveries, requested gold, argued over brides. The New Kingdom was Egypt's imperial age, confident and expansive, looking outward instead of inward. And some of its most fascinating characters were about to take the stage. Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh. When Thutmose II died around 1479 BCE, he left behind a young son, Thutmose III, who was too young to rule. Someone needed to serve as regent until the boy came of age. That someone was Thutmose II's principal wife, Hatshepsut. She was royal by birth, daughter of Thutmose I, and she understood power. She'd been great royal wife, the highest position a woman could hold. But regent apparently wasn't enough for her. Within a few years of her husband's death, Hatshepsut did something extraordinary. She declared herself pharaoh, not queen, not regent, but king of Egypt. She adopted the full royal titulary, the 5 names every pharaoh bore. She wore the false beard, that ceremonial goatee pharaohs wore as a symbol of authority. She dressed in male regalia in official art, though some depictions kept her clearly female. She ruled as a man, or as much as a woman could, within a system that assumed pharaohs were male by divine design. The audacity of this move cannot be overstated. Egypt had queens before, powerful women who influenced their husbands or sons. But a woman claiming to be Pharaoh, the living god, the embodiment of Horus, that was unprecedented. Later kings' lists sometimes omitted her entirely, as if acknowledging her reign would crack the cosmic order. But for about 22 years Hatshepsut was Egypt, and by most measures she was good at it. Her reign was remarkably peaceful. No major wars, no invasions, no crises. Instead, she focused on internal development, trade, and monumental building projects. She understood that legitimacy came from visible success, from demonstrating that the gods approved of her rule through prosperity and achievement, and she delivered. Her most famous accomplishment was the trading expedition to Punt, a legendary land somewhere along the Red Sea coast, possibly modern-day Eritrea or Somalia. Punt was known for luxury goods: myrrh, frankincense, gold, ivory, exotic animals. Hatshepsut sent a fleet of 5 ships on a journey that took years. When they returned, laden with treasures, she commemorated the expedition in detailed reliefs on her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. These reliefs are wonderful. They show Egyptian ships sailing south, arriving in Punt, meeting the local ruler and his rather rotund wife. The Egyptians politely not commenting on her weight. They show goods being loaded, neat rows of myrrh trees in pots, because Hatshepsut wanted to transplant them to Egypt. Live trees transported across hundreds of miles by sea to be planted at her temple. The ambition is almost absurd, and apparently it worked. The reliefs show the trees thriving in Egyptian soil. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari is a masterpiece. Built into the cliffs on the west bank at Thebes, it rises in 3 terraced levels connected by ramps. The architecture is elegant, harmonious, very different from the massive bulk of earlier temples. It feels almost modern in its clean lines and integration with the natural landscape. Hatshepsut clearly had excellent taste, or at least hired architects who did. Inside the temple, inscriptions explain her legitimacy. They claim that Amun-Ra himself visited her mother in divine form and fathered Hatshepsut, a divine birth myth, similar to what male pharaohs claimed but with extra emphasis because she needed extra justification. The texts describe how Amun chose her from birth to rule, how Thutmose I himself proclaimed her heir. Whether any of this was historically true is debatable. What matters is she felt the need to make the argument, to convince the elite and the priesthood that her rule was divinely ordained. And for 2 decades it worked. She ruled alongside Thutmose III, who remained co-regent, at least in name. Whether he resented this arrangement, whether he chafed at being sidelined by his stepmother, the sources don't clearly tell us. He didn't rebel. He served as a military commander, kept a low profile, waited. Then, around 1458 BCE, Hatshepsut disappears from the record. She probably died, though we don't know how or exactly when. Her mummy was eventually identified in the early 21st century CE through DNA analysis, found in a modest tomb in the Valley of the Kings, not the grand burial she'd prepared for herself. Her body showed she was overweight, diabetic, possibly died from bone cancer or an abscess. Not a dramatic end, just a human one. After her death, someone, possibly Thutmose III, late in his own reign, ordered her images defaced and her names chiselled out of inscriptions. Not everywhere, not thoroughly, but enough to create confusion. Was it revenge? Was it an attempt to erase an anomaly from the historical record? To restore the proper male succession? We don't know. Thutmose III waited decades before doing this, if it was him, which suggests something more calculated than immediate anger. Hatshepsut's legacy is complicated. She proved a woman could rule Egypt successfully. She also remained an anomaly, the exception that proves the rule. No woman would hold the throne in the same way again until Cleopatra, over 1,000 years later. But for 22 years, she was pharaoh, and Egypt thrived. That has to count for something. Thutmose III and his conquests. Once Hatshepsut was gone, Thutmose III finally had the throne to himself. He'd waited decades, served as co-regent while his stepmother played pharaoh, commanded armies, but always in her shadow. Now finally, he was sole ruler, and he had plans. Thutmose III would become known as Egypt's greatest warrior pharaoh, the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. Though that comparison is somewhat unfair to Thutmose, since Napoleon's empire lasted only about 15 years, while Thutmose campaigned successfully for over 30. He wasn't content with Egypt's existing borders or sphere of influence. He wanted to dominate the entire Near East, to make every kingdom from Nubia to Syria acknowledge Egyptian supremacy. His first major campaign came early, against a coalition of Canaanite and Syrian city-states that had rebelled during the transition of power. They'd gathered at Megiddo, a fortified city in what's now northern Israel. Megiddo was strategically vital, controlling trade routes through the region. If you wanted to dominate the Levant, you needed Megiddo. Thutmose marched his army north. When he reached the mountains near Megiddo, his advisors warned him about the direct route. It was narrow, dangerous, perfect for ambush. They suggested a longer, safer path. Thutmose refused. He understood psychology. Taking the dangerous route would catch the enemy off guard and demonstrate his courage to his own troops. Bold moves inspire loyalty, so they marched through the narrow pass, single file, vulnerable, and emerged on the other side to find the enemy completely unprepared. The Battle of Megiddo was a decisive Egyptian victory. The coalition forces broke and fled to the city. Egyptian records claim that if the soldiers hadn't stopped to loot the enemy camp, they could have taken the city immediately. Instead, Megiddo held out under siege for 7 months before finally surrendering. Thutmose captured the city, took the rulers prisoner, seized enormous quantities of gold, silver, horses, chariots, and weapons. He also claimed to have captured 330 princes, which seems like a lot of princes, but ancient battle records are famously optimistic with their numbers. But Megiddo was just the beginning. Over his reign, Thutmose launched 17 recorded military campaigns into Syria and the Levant. 17. Most pharaohs managed 1 or 2 in their entire reign. Thutmose made it an annual event. Spring would come, the campaigning season would open, and Thutmose would march north with his army. He established Egyptian garrisons, installed loyal governors, extracted tribute, and made it clear that rebellion would be met with overwhelming force. He pushed Egyptian control further north than any pharaoh before him, crossing the Euphrates River and defeating the Mitanni, a powerful kingdom that had been challenging Egypt's influence in Syria. He erected a stele on the banks of the Euphrates, just as his grandfather Thutmose I had done, a declaration that Egypt's reach extended this far and no further without permission. In the south, he campaigned in Nubia, ensuring that Egypt's southern border remained secure and the gold kept flowing north. Nubian gold was vital to Egypt's economy and international prestige. When you're negotiating with other great powers, having access to unlimited gold helps a lot. Thutmose wasn't just a conqueror, he was an administrator. He understood that conquest without consolidation is meaningless. He established a system of vassal states, local rulers who swore loyalty to Egypt and paid annual tribute. Their sons were taken to Egypt as hostages, though they were treated well, educated in Egyptian ways, essentially indoctrinated. When their fathers died, these Egyptian-educated princes returned home to rule as loyal vassals. It was a brilliant system of cultural imperialism. The wealth from these campaigns transformed Egypt. Tribute flowed into Thebes, gold, silver, copper, timber, oils, wine, slaves, exotic animals. The temples grew rich, especially the temple of Ammon at Karnak, because Thutmose credited the god with his victories. He expanded Karnak massively, adding halls, pylons, obelisks. 2 of his obelisks still stand in Karnak today. One eventually travelled much further, now standing in Istanbul, while another wound up in New York City's Central Park. Even in pieces, Thutmose's monuments travelled far. He also left detailed records of his campaigns. The annals of Thutmose III, carved on the walls of Karnak, describe his battles year by year. They list booty captured, cities conquered, distances travelled. They're propaganda, certainly, emphasising victories and downplaying setbacks, but they're also valuable historical records. We know more about Thutmose III's military activities than almost any other ancient Egyptian pharaoh, because he had it all written down. His reign lasted 54 years total, 33 as sole ruler after Hatshepsut's death. By the time he died around 1425 BCE, Egypt was the dominant power in the Near East. No kingdom could match its military strength or economic resources. The empire stretched from the fourth cataract of the Nile in Nubia to the Euphrates in Syria. It was vast, wealthy and secure. Thutmose III was buried in the Valley of the Kings. His tomb was robbed in antiquity, but his mummy survived, moved by priests to a secret cache with other royal mummies to protect them from further desecration. When archaeologists found the cache in the late 19th century CE, they unwrapped Thutmose and found a small man barely 5 feet tall. Apparently, You don't need to be tall to conquer the world. Just determined. Akhenaten and the sun disk. Egypt had been worshipping the same gods for well over 1,000 years. Amun-Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, Thoth, Hathor, the whole divine pantheon. The priests were powerful, the temples were wealthy, the system worked. Then along came Amenhotep IV, and he decided to change everything. Amen. Hotei IV came to power around 1353 BCE during the 18th dynasty's peak. Egypt was rich, secure, dominant. He inherited an empire at its zenith, and he used that power to launch the most radical religious revolution in Egyptian history. Within a few years of taking the throne, he declared that all the traditional gods were meaningless. There was only one true god, the Aten, the solar disk, the physical sun itself. Not the sun god Ra, not a deity with a complex mythology, just the sun visible in the sky, its rays extending down to touch the earth and give life. He changed his name from Amenhotep, which meant Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, beneficial to the Aten. That wasn't a subtle shift. That was a public rejection of Amun, the king of the gods, the patron deity of Thebes, the god whose priests were among the most powerful people in Egypt. Akhenaten was picking a fight with the entire religious establishment. But he didn't stop there. He ordered the temples of the old gods closed. He redirected their wealth to the Aten. He had the name of Amun chiseled out of inscriptions across Egypt, even inside tombs, even on his father's monuments. He sent workers with chisels and mallets to erase the old gods from stone. The vindictiveness was shocking. This wasn't theological debate. This was ideological warfare. Then he abandoned Thebes entirely. He built a brand new capital city in the desert, halfway between Thebes and Memphis, on a stretch of land that had no prior religious associations. He called it Akhenaten, Horizon of the Atan. Today we call it Amarna. The city rose quickly, constructed in mud brick and painted plaster, gleaming white in the desert sun. Temples to the Atan, palaces for the royal family, administrative buildings, houses for officials and workers. An entire city created from nothing in just a few years. Akhenaten moved the court to Amarna and declared this was now Egypt's capital. He would never return to Thebes. He surrounded himself with loyalists, people who owed their positions to him rather than the old system. He promoted commoners to high office based on loyalty to his new religion. The traditional elite, especially the priests of Amun, were left behind in Thebes, stripped of power and fuming. The art from Akhenaten's reign is bizarre by Egyptian standards. Traditional Egyptian art was formal, idealized, unchanging for centuries. Pharaohs were depicted as eternally youthful, muscular, perfect. Akhenaten's artists threw that out. They showed him with an elongated face, thick lips, a long neck, a popped belly, wide hips, spindly legs. His wife Nefertiti and their daughters were depicted similarly, though somewhat less exaggerated. Some scholars think Akhenaten had a genetic condition, maybe Marfan syndrome or a hormonal disorder. Others think the strange proportions were theological, emphasizing his unique status as the Akhenaten sole intermediary. Either way, the art is unsettling, almost alien. Nefertiti, Akhenaten's great royal wife, appears constantly in reliefs and statues from Amarna. She's shown alongside Akhenaten in scenes of worship, equal in size, equal in importance. Sometimes she performs rituals alone, acting as Pharaoh would. Her famous bust, found at Amarna and now in Berlin, shows a woman of striking beauty, though some argue the idealized perfection contradicts the Amarna art style's supposed realism. Maybe they made an exception for the queen's face. Even revolutionaries have their limits. Akhenaten and Nefertiti had 6 daughters. No sons, at least none who survived. The family is shown in intimate domestic scenes, something rare in Egyptian royal art. The king kissing his daughters, the family eating together, informal moments that humanize the pharaoh. Whether this was genuine affection or propaganda to show the royal family as blessed by the Aten is impossible to say. Maybe both. Meanwhile, the empire was neglected. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence found at the site, show vassal rulers in the Levant pleading for Egyptian military support against invaders and rivals. Akhenaten barely responded. He was too focused on his religious revolution to care about foreign policy. Egyptian influence in Syria and Palestine weakened. Allies felt abandoned. The system Thutmose III built began to fracture. Akhenaten ruled for about 17 years. Then he died, suddenly, under unclear circumstances. No explanation in the records, no grand burial. His body has never been conclusively identified, though some think a mummy found in the Valley of the Kings might be him. His new capital was abandoned almost immediately after his death. The court returned to Thebes. The temples of the old gods reopened. The priests of Amun reclaimed their power and wealth. And they took revenge. Akhenaten's name was struck from king lists. His monuments were dismantled. His city was left to the desert. Later pharaohs referred to him only as the enemy, or the rebel. The Egyptians tried to erase him from history as thoroughly as he'd tried to erase Amun. Almost worked too. But not quite. The Boy King Tutankhamun. After Akhenaten's death, Egypt was in chaos. The religious revolution had failed, the old priesthood was angry, the empire was weakening, and the succession was murky. A brief mysterious reign by someone named Smenkhkare, possibly a co-regent or even Nefertiti under a different name, lasted maybe a year or two. Then came a child. His birth name was Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten. He was probably around 8 or 9 years old when he became pharaoh, around 1332 BCE. A child king in a fractured kingdom. He didn't choose this. He was born into the royal family during Akhenaten's reign, possibly Akhenaten's son, though the exact parentage is disputed. DNA analysis suggests Akhenaten was indeed his father, and his mother was one of Akhenaten's sisters, because royal incest was a thing. The family tree looks more like a family wreath. The boy was too young to rule, obviously. Real power sat with his advisors, particularly a man named Ai, who held the title of vizier, and Horemheb, the commander of the army. These men understood that Akhenaten's religious experiment was a disaster and needed to be undone, so they guided the young king toward restoration. Within a few years, the boy's name changed from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. That wasn't subtle. It was a public declaration that the old gods were back. The court abandoned Amarna and returned to Thebes. The temples of Amun reopened. The priests resumed their rituals. Wealth flowed back to the traditional temples. The restoration stela, erected during Tutankhamun's reign, describes how he found the temples in ruins, the gods abandoned, and how he restored everything to proper order. Whether the physical destruction was real or exaggerated for propaganda is debatable, but the message was clear: the Amun heresy was over. Tutankhamun married Ankhesenamun, who was probably his half-sister, another daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. She was a few years older. They were children married for political reasons, continuing the royal bloodline, cementing legitimacy. Their marriage produced 2 daughters, both stillborn, their tiny mummified bodies later found in Tutankhamun's tomb. The tragedy of those failed pregnancies, of a young couple trying to produce an heir and failing, is quietly heartbreaking. Tutankhamun's reign lasted about 10 years. He never achieved anything particularly remarkable. He was a puppet king, a figurehead, while powerful men behind the scenes ran the country. He probably participated in some military campaigns, or at least was present for them so he could claim credit. Art shows him as a warrior, shooting arrows from his chariot, trampling enemies, but those are standard pharaonic propaganda images. Every king was depicted as a mighty warrior regardless of reality. Then, around 18 years old, Tutankhamun died. Suddenly, the cause is still debated. His mummy shows he had a broken leg shortly before death, possibly from a chariot accident. He also had malaria, evidence found in his DNA. He had a cleft palate and a club foot, likely from the inbreeding. Maybe the broken leg got infected and sepsis killed him. Maybe malaria weakened him and complications finished the job. Maybe it was something else entirely. He was a physically fragile young man, and something, or several somethings, went wrong. His death left no heir. The royal line was in trouble. Ankhesenamun, his young widow, was in a precarious position. A letter survives, sent from an Egyptian queen to the Hittite king, pleading for him to send one of his sons to marry her because she was afraid and had no husband. The Hittite king was suspicious. This was unprecedented, but eventually sent a prince. That prince was murdered before reaching Egypt, possibly by Horemheb's agents, possibly by someone else who didn't want a foreign king. Akhenaten disappears from the record after that. She probably was forced to marry I, the aging vizier who took the throne briefly before dying himself. Then Horemheb, the general, seized power and became pharaoh, ending the 18th dynasty messily. None of this would matter much to history if not for one extraordinary fact. Tutankhamun's tomb survived almost intact. Most royal tombs were robbed in antiquity, stripped of everything valuable, but Tutankhamun's tomb, probably because it was small and hastily prepared, because he died young and unexpectedly, was robbed only partially and then forgotten. The entrance was buried under debris from later construction. It sat hidden in the Valley of the Kings for over 3,000 years. Then, in 1922 CE, Howard Carter, a British archaeologist, found it. When he broke through the sealed door and held up a candle, he saw wonders. Gold everywhere. Furniture, chariots, clothing, jewellery, statues, the intact sarcophagus, and inside it the mummy of the Boy King wearing a solid gold mask that has become one of the most iconic images in history. The tomb contained over 5,000 objects. The inventory took years. The treasures filled museums. And suddenly, Tutankhamun, who accomplished almost nothing in life, became the most famous pharaoh of all time. History has a sense of irony. Ramesses the Second, builder of monuments. If Tutankhamun is the most famous pharaoh by accident, Ramesses the Second earned his fame the old-fashioned way through relentless self-promotion. He ruled for 66 years, from 1279 to 1213 BCE, and spent nearly every moment of that reign making absolutely certain that future generations would remember him. And it worked. We're still talking about him. Ramesses came to power as a young man in the 19th dynasty. His father, Seti I, had been a capable pharaoh who restored Egyptian power after the chaos of the post-Amarna period. But Ramesses would far surpass his father in ambition, longevity, and sheer output of monuments. He didn't just want to be a great pharaoh, he wanted to be the greatest pharaoh who ever lived, and he had 66 years to make his case. He built more temples, erected more statues, and carved more inscriptions than any other pharaoh. If you visit Egypt today, you're going to see Ramesses everywhere. The temples at Abu Simbel, carved into a mountainside in Nubia, with 4 colossal seated statues of Ramesses guarding the entrance, each over 60 feet tall. The Ramesseum, his massive mortuary temple on the west bank at Thebes, additions to the temples at Karnak and Luxor, statues scattered across the country. His name is on everything, sometimes literally carved over the names of previous pharaohs. He had no shame about usurping earlier monuments, chiseling out the original king's name and inserting his own. Efficient, if ethically questionable. His reign saw massive construction projects that required enormous resources. Tens of thousands of workers quarried stone, transported it, carved it, raised it into position. The logistics were staggering, but Ramesses had the wealth to fund it. Tribute flowing from vassal states, gold from Nubia, trade revenues from across the Mediterranean, and he had time. 66 years is a long reign by any standard. He outlived many of his own children. When he finally died, around 90 years old, an entire generation had grown up knowing no other pharaoh. He had many wives as pharaohs did, but his principal queen was Nefertari, and he clearly favoured her, at least early in their marriage. He built a temple for her at Abu Simbel, right next to his own, a rare honour. The smaller temple features statues of Nefertari as tall as Ramesses himself, which is shocking because pharaohs' wives were usually depicted much smaller. Inside, the walls are covered with beautiful reliefs showing Nefertari with various gods. Her tomb in the Valley of the Queens is one of the most exquisitely decorated in all of Egypt, though whether Ramesses commissioned it or she died before him and he was grieving is unclear. Nefertari eventually fades from the record, and another wife, Isetnefret, becomes more prominent. Ramesses had dozens of children, estimates range from 80 to over 100. Many sons, many daughters, most of whom never became pharaoh because they died before their impossibly long-lived father. His 13th son, Merneptah, eventually inherited the throne when Ramesses finally died, and Merneptah was already elderly by that point. Imagine waiting your entire life for your father to die so you can be king, and you're 60 years old when it finally happens. Ramesses was obsessed with his image, both literally and figuratively. His statues show him as eternally youthful, strong, victorious, Even when he was ancient, the art depicted him as a vigorous warrior in his prime. The inscriptions describe him as beloved of the gods, mighty in battle, wise in council, the perfect king. If you only knew Ramesses through his monuments, you'd think he was superhuman. His mummy tells a different story. When it was examined in modern times, scientists found an old man with arthritis, dental abscesses, hardened arteries, and a curved spine. He'd been tall for an Egyptian, about 5'9", with red hair that turned white with age. He'd lived a long life, suffered the ailments of aging, and eventually died like everyone else. But he'd fought decay every step of the way, building monuments, carving his name, ensuring immortality through stone. Ramesses understood something fundamental about power. Perception matters. It doesn't matter if you're the greatest warrior if no one remembers you. It doesn't matter if you're wise if your wisdom dies with you. But if you build temples that last thousands of years, if you carve your name so deeply into stone that it can't be erased, if you flood the landscape with your image, then you achieve a kind of immortality. And he was right. We remember Ramesses the Second. Not because he was the greatest general, he wasn't. Not because he was the wisest administrator, debatable. We remember him because he made it impossible to forget him. Every temple shouts his name. Every statue bears his face. He turned self-promotion into an art form. Subtlety was never his strength, but permanence was. And in the end, permanence is what mattered. The Battle of Kadesh. Ramesses the Second didn't just build monuments. He also fought wars, or at least he claimed to. And the centerpiece of his military propaganda was the Battle of Kadesh, fought in 1274 BCE, in the 5th year of his reign. If you believe Ramesses' version of events, carved on multiple temple walls across Egypt, it was his greatest triumph, a personal victory against impossible odds. If you read between the lines, it was more complicated than that. The conflict was with the Hittites, a powerful empire based in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. For decades, Egypt and the Hittites had been competing for control of Syria and the Levant, the lucrative trade routes and wealthy city-states between their two empires. The city of Kadesh, on the Orontes River in Syria, was strategically vital. It had changed hands before. Now the Hittite king Muwatalli II held it, and Ramesses wanted it back. Ramesses assembled an army of around 20,000 men, divided into 4 divisions named after gods: Amun, Ra, Ponor, and Seth. He marched north through the Levant, confident and eager, according to his own accounts, perhaps a bit too confident. As he approached Kadesh, Egyptian scouts captured 2 Bedouins who claimed to be deserters from the Hittite army. They told Ramesses that Muwatalli and his forces were still far to the north near Aleppo, too afraid to face the mighty Egyptian army. Ramesses believed them. It was a trap. The Bedouins were plants feeding false information. The Hittite army wasn't far away. It was hidden just beyond Kadesh, on the other side of the city, waiting. Ramesses, convinced the enemy was distant, pressed forward with the Amun division, his personal guard. The other 3 divisions trailed behind, strung out along the march route. Then the Hittites struck. They burst from their hiding position and slammed into the Ra division, the second in line, catching it completely by surprise. The Ra division broke and fled in panic. Suddenly, Ramesses and the Amun division were isolated, separated from the rest of the army, with Hittite chariots charging toward them. This is where Ramesses' version of events becomes, let's say, creative. According to the official account, inscribed on temple walls and known as the Poem of Pentor, Ramesses found himself surrounded and abandoned. His soldiers fled, his officers deserted him. He was alone, or nearly so, facing thousands of enemy chariots. So he called out to Amun, his patron god, asking why the god would abandon him after all his devotion. Amun answered. The god filled Ramesses with divine strength. The pharaoh, single-handedly or nearly so, charged into the Hittite forces. He shot arrows with perfect accuracy, each one finding its mark. He trampled enemies beneath his horses. He was a one-man army, a hero from myth, unstoppable. The Hittites fell before him like wheat before a scythe. His bravery inspired his scattered soldiers to rally. The tide turned. Egypt was saved. It's a great story. Rousing, dramatic, perfect for propaganda. The reality was almost certainly different. What probably happened is that Ramesses did fight bravely. He wasn't a coward, but he was also rescued by the timely arrival of the Nenerin, a group of Egyptian troops who'd been marching along the coast, and arrived just in time to hit the Hittites from an unexpected direction. The battle became chaotic. Both sides fought hard, casualties mounted. Eventually, both armies pulled back, exhausted. The next day, there was more fighting, indecisive skirmishing, and both sides had apparently had enough. They withdrew. Ramesses marched his army back to Egypt. The Hittites kept Kadesh. By any objective measure, the battle was at best a draw, at worst a tactical defeat for Egypt. Ramesses had failed to take Kadesh. He'd walked into an ambush. He'd nearly lost his army. But you wouldn't know that from Egyptian records. Ramesses proclaimed Kadesh a great victory and had the story carved on every major temple he built. The Ramesseum, Abu Simbel, Karnak, Luxor, they all feature elaborate reliefs showing Ramesses as the hero of Kadesh, single-handedly defeating the Hittites through personal valor and divine favor. He commissioned multiple written accounts, poems, official bulletins, all telling the same story of miraculous victory. The Hittites had their own version. Naturally, their records describe the battle as a Hittite victory, with the Egyptians driven off and Kadesh remaining in Hittite hands. Both sides claim to have won, which usually means nobody really won. What's fascinating is that 16 years later, Ramesses and the Hittites signed a peace treaty, one of the earliest recorded peace treaties in history. Copies survive in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform. The treaty established borders, mutual defense pacts, extradition agreements. It was a practical solution after decades of expensive, inconclusive warfare. Neither side could decisively defeat the other, so they agreed to coexist. Ramesses even married a Hittite princess to seal the deal. Peace through diplomacy and marriage alliances, far more effective than his great victory at Kadesh ever was. But the peace treaty didn't make for exciting temple reliefs, so we got the heroic version instead. The Valley of the Kings. On the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, where the cliffs rise stark and golden in the desert sun, lies a narrow winding valley. The ancient Egyptians called it Tarsiket Ma'at, the Great Field. Today we call it the Valley of the Kings, and it's one of the most famous burial grounds in the world. For nearly 500 years from the 18th through the 20th dynasties, Egypt's pharaohs were buried here, their tombs carved deep into the limestone rock, hidden from thieves and time, or at least that was the plan. The valley was chosen deliberately. It's remote, accessible only through a narrow entrance that could be guarded. The limestone is relatively soft, easy to carve, but stable enough not to collapse. And perhaps most importantly, the natural pyramid-shaped peak that towers over the valley Alul Qurn may have held religious significance, a natural pyramid watching over the royal tombs below. The symbolism would have appealed to the Egyptians, who saw meaning in everything. The first pharaoh buried here was probably Thutmose I, around 1500 BCE. His architect Enini left an inscription boasting that he supervised the excavation of the king's tomb in secret, with no one watching. Whether that was true, or just Enini being dramatic, the point was clear: secrecy was essential. The pyramid tombs of the Old Kingdom had advertised their contents to every thief in Egypt. The Valley of the Kings would be different: hidden, protected, eternal. Each tomb followed a similar pattern, a stairway or corridor descending into the rock, passages cutting deeper into the cliff, chambers branching off, and finally the burial chamber itself, deep in the mountain's heart. The walls were covered with religious texts and images: the Book of the Dead, the Book of Gates, the Book of Caverns, the Amduat. These weren't decorations, they were guidebooks for the afterlife, spells and instructions the dead pharaoh needed to navigate the underworld, defeat its dangers and achieve resurrection. The burial chamber held the sarcophagus. Massive stone containers nested one inside another, and within them the mummified body of the pharaoh surrounded by amulets, jewelry and protective spells. The chambers were filled with everything the king might need in eternity: furniture, clothing, food, weapons, chariots, boats, statues of servants and gods. The tombs were houses for eternity, stocked for an infinite journey. After the burial, the tomb was sealed. Workers filled the entrance corridor with rubble. Guards were posted. Priests maintained mortuary temples nearby, performing daily rituals to sustain the pharaoh's spirit. The system was designed to last forever. It didn't work. Almost every tomb in the Valley of the Kings was robbed, most within a few generations of the burial. Thieves were clever, persistent, and often had inside information. Some of the robberies were clearly insider jobs, tomb workers or guards who knew exactly where the entrances were hidden. Ancient papyri record trials of tomb robbers, their confessions extracted under torture describing how they tunneled through walls, smashed through seals, stripped mummies of their gold, and melted down priceless artifacts for the raw materials. One papyrus describes robbers breaking into the tomb of Ramesses the Sixth. They listed the gold they found, the amount they split among themselves, casual and businesslike, as if looting a god king's eternal resting place was just another day at work. The bandits were eventually caught and executed, but the damage was done. The tombs were violated, the treasures scattered. By the 21st dynasty, the situation had become so bad that the priests gave up on security. They moved the royal mummies, gathering them from their individual tombs and hiding them in secret caches, plain shafts where dozens of kings were stacked like firewood, stripped of most valuables but at least kept safe from further desecration. One cache, found in 1881 CE, contained over 50 mummies including Ramesses the Second, Seti the First, Thutmose the Third, and other great pharaohs, all jumbled together in a desperate attempt at preservation. The Valley of the Kings was gradually forgotten. Sand and debris covered the entrances. The mortuary temples crumbled. Knowledge of the exact locations faded. By the time Greek and Roman tourists visited Egypt, the valley was already ancient history, mostly buried and abandoned. A few tombs remained accessible, used as shelters by hermits or curious travelers who left graffiti on the walls. Modern archaeology began rediscovering the valley in the 19th century. Dozens of tombs were excavated, mapped, their contents catalogued or already gone. By the early 20th century, most Egyptologists believed the valley had been thoroughly explored. There were no more tombs to find. Then Howard Carter found Tutankhamun in 1922, and suddenly the world remembered why the Valley of the Kings mattered. One nearly intact tomb revealed wonders beyond imagination. If that's what a minor pharaoh had, what must the great kings have possessed? What treasures were stolen and melted down, lost forever? The valley holds at least 63 known tombs, though not all for pharaohs. Some belong to queens, princes or nobles, and there may be more, still hidden, waiting beneath the sand and stone. The Valley of the Kings was meant to be eternal. Instead, it became a reminder that nothing lasts, not even eternity. The Sea Peoples and Egypt's decline. The Late Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE, was a time of interconnected civilizations. Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenaean Greece, the city-states of the Levant, all traded with each other, fought with each other, married into each other's royal families. It was a complex system, stable enough that it had lasted for centuries. Then suddenly, it collapsed. The collapse wasn't gradual, it was catastrophic. Within a few decades, the entire eastern Mediterranean world fell apart. The Hittite Empire vanished. Mycenaean palaces burned. Cities across the Levant were destroyed. Trade routes disintegrated. Literacy declined in some regions, disappeared entirely in others. Archaeologists call it the Late Bronze Age collapse, and it's one of history's great mysteries. What happened? Why did this interconnected world suddenly implode? Part of the answer involves a mysterious group called the Sea Peoples. Egyptian records describe them as invaders from the sea, raiders and migrants who swept across the Mediterranean, destroying everything in their path. They attacked repeatedly in waves, coming from the north and west. Egyptian texts list their names: the Pilaset, the Jerka, the Shekelish, the Danyan, the Weshesh. We don't know exactly where they came from, or even if they were a unified group. They might have been displaced populations fleeing some disaster in their homelands, or opportunistic raiders taking advantage of collapsing kingdoms, or a mix of both. Ramesses III, who ruled in the early 12th century BCE during the 20th dynasty, faced the full force of the Sea Peoples' invasions. They came by land and sea, a massive coalition attacking Egypt's borders. Ramesses met them in a series of battles, and according to his inscriptions at Medinet Habu, his massive mortuary temple, he won decisively. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show naval battles, Egyptian ships clashing with Sea People's vessels. Archers fire from the decks, ships capsize, Enemies drown. On land, Egyptian chariots charge into formations of Sea People's warriors, who are shown with distinctive feathered headdresses and kilts. The Egyptians triumphant, the invaders defeated. Ramesses III saved Egypt. Or did he? The inscriptions are propaganda, as always. Ramesses III may have beaten back the Sea Peoples, but the victory was Pyrrhic. The invasions devastated Egypt's vassal states in the Levant. The empire Thutmose III and Ramesses II built crumbled. Trade networks broke down, tribute stopped flowing. Egypt survived, but it was wounded, weakened, isolated in a suddenly much darker world. Some of the Sea Peoples apparently settled in the Levant after being defeated. The people set became the Philistines, settling along the coast of what's now Gaza and southern Israel. The name Palestine derives from them. Others scattered across the Mediterranean, disappearing into history as mysteriously as they appeared. But the Sea Peoples weren't the only problem. Egypt faced internal troubles too. The economy was struggling. The cost of defending against invasions, combined with the loss of tribute from the empire, strained resources. Grain prices rose. Workers went on strike. The first recorded labour strike in history occurred during this period, when tomb workers at Deir el-Medina weren't paid and refused to work until they received their rations. Even the workers building royal tombs were going hungry. Not a good sign. The priesthood of Amun had grown incredibly wealthy and powerful, controlling vast estates and resources. Some estimates suggest the temple of Amun at Karnak controlled up to a third of Egypt's arable land by the end of the New Kingdom. The priests were essentially a state within a state, and they didn't always align with the pharaoh's interests. Ramesses III was eventually assassinated in a palace conspiracy, possibly involving one of his secondary wives who wanted her son on the throne. The plot was discovered, the conspirators tried and executed, but the king died from his wounds. His mummy shows a deep cut across his throat, probably the killing blow. Even in death they tried to hide it, wrapping the wound carefully to preserve royal dignity. After Ramesses III, a succession of kings named Ramesses followed, the 4th through the 11th, all weak rulers presiding over continued decline. They're barely distinguishable in the historical record, a parade of failures. The empire was gone. Egypt's borders shrank back to the Nile Valley. The army was filled with foreign mercenaries, Libyans and Nubians, because native Egyptian manpower was insufficient or unwilling. The New Kingdom, that age of imperial glory, was ending not with a bang but with a slow grinding collapse. By the end of the 20th dynasty, around 1069 BCE, the pharaoh ruled in name only. Real power split between the high priest of Amun in Thebes in the south and the pharaoh's officials in the north. Egypt fragmented again, falling into what historians call the Third Intermediate Period. The unified kingdom that had lasted over 1,000 years broke apart. The age of Egypt's greatness, the pyramids and empires and gold-masked kings, was over. What came next would be centuries of division, foreign rule, and slow decline. But the story wasn't finished yet. The Late Period and foreign rule. After the New Kingdom collapsed, Egypt entered a long period of fragmentation and foreign domination. The Third Intermediate Period saw the country split between rival dynasties, Libyan rulers in the north, native Egyptian kings in the south, Nubian pharaohs pushing up from the south. It was messy, confusing, the kind of period where even Egyptologists struggle to keep the timeline straight. Power was decentralized, local rulers acted independently, and Egypt's days as a major power seemed finished. Then came the Late Period, beginning around 664 BCE, and things got even more complicated. Foreign powers weren't just influencing Egypt anymore. They were conquering it, ruling it directly, turning Egypt into a province of larger empires. For a civilization that had seen itself as the center of the world for over 2,000 years, this was a profound humiliation. The Assyrians came first. The Assyrian Empire, based in Mesopotamia, was the superpower of the 7th century BCE. Brutal and efficient, they swept through the Levant and into Egypt around 671 BCE. Their king Esarhaddon conquered Memphis and claimed the title of pharaoh. His son Ashurbanipal pushed further, all the way to Thebes, and sacked the city in 663 BCE. Thebes, the glorious capital of the New Kingdom, city of Amun, was looted and burned. The shock rippled across the ancient world. If Thebes could fall, nowhere was safe. The Assyrian occupation was brief and chaotic. They couldn't maintain direct control over Egypt. It was too far from their power base, so they relied on local puppet rulers. One of these, Psamtik I, managed to consolidate power after the Assyrians withdrew, establishing the 26th dynasty and beginning what's called the Site period, named after his capital city of Sicca in the Delta. The Site period was actually a renaissance of sorts. Psamtik and his successors consciously looked back to Egypt's glorious past, reviving old and Middle Kingdom art styles, restoring ancient temples, promoting traditional religion and culture. It was a nostalgic attempt to recapture lost greatness. They couldn't rebuild the empire, Egypt was too weak for that, but they could at least preserve Egyptian identity and culture. They hired Greek mercenaries for the army, and encouraged Greek traders to settle in Egypt. The Mediterranean world was changing, and Egypt was cautiously engaging with it. But independence didn't last. In 525 BCE, the Persians invaded. Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, conquered Egypt and made it a province of the Persian Empire. The Persians ruled as pharaohs, adopting Egyptian titles and supporting temples, but they were foreign rulers nonetheless. Egyptian sources, written much later, describe Cambyses as a monster who killed the sacred Apis bull and desecrated temples. Persian sources paint a different picture, showing Cambyses respecting Egyptian religion. As always, the truth probably lies somewhere between propaganda and counter-propaganda. The Persians ruled for about a century, with a brief interruption when Egypt rebelled and enjoyed 60 years of independence under native dynasties, the 28th through 30th. But it didn't last. In 343 BCE, the Persians reconquered Egypt, and this second Persian period was harsher than the first. Then came Alexander the Great. In 332 BCE, the young Macedonian king swept through the Persian Empire like a storm. He invaded Egypt in 331 BCE and was welcomed more or less as a liberator. The Persians had been unpopular, and Alexander was smart enough to present himself as a respecter of Egyptian culture. He visited the Oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis in the Western Desert, and the priests allegedly proclaimed him the son of Amun, a legitimate pharaoh by divine right. Whether Alexander believed it or was just politically savvy enough to play along, it worked. He founded the city of Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, which would become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Alexander didn't stay long. He had a Persian empire to conquer. He left Egypt under the administration of his generals and marched east. He never returned. He died in Babylon in 323 BCE, at age 32, and his empire immediately fractured as his generals fought over the pieces. In Egypt, one of those generals, Ptolemy, seized power. He took Alexander's body, possibly by force, and brought it back to Egypt for burial. A powerful symbol of legitimacy, Ptolemy declared himself pharaoh, founding the Ptolemaic dynasty, the last dynasty to rule an independent Egypt. The Ptolemies were Greek, not Egyptian. They spoke Greek, promoted Greek culture, built Greek-style cities. But they also understood that to rule Egypt they needed to appeal to Egyptian sensibilities. So they built temples in traditional Egyptian style, participated in Egyptian religious festivals, and took on pharaonic titles. They were Greek kings playing pharaoh, a balancing act between two cultures. For nearly 300 years the Ptolemies ruled Egypt, presiding over a wealthy, culturally vibrant kingdom. Alexandria became a centre of learning, home to the famous library and museum, attracting scholars from across the Mediterranean. But the Ptolemaic kingdom was trapped between cultures, between past and future, between independence and the growing power of Rome. And Rome was coming. Cleopatra and the end of the pharaohs. By the 1st century BCE, the Ptolemaic dynasty was a shadow of its former self. Decades of civil wars, sibling rivalries, and incompetent rulers had weakened Egypt. Meanwhile, Rome had become the dominant Mediterranean power, and the Romans were very interested in Egypt. It was wealthy, produced massive amounts of grain, and was strategically vital. The Ptolemies survived by playing Roman politics carefully, making alliances, paying bribes, staying useful. Then came Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra became pharaoh in 51 BCE, at age 18, co-ruling with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, who was about 10. This was standard Ptolemaic practice. Siblings married and ruled together. It was weird, but by this point the dynasty had been doing it for centuries. The marriage was political, ceremonial. Real power was the question, and Cleopatra wanted it. She and her brother, or rather their advisors, quickly came into conflict. By 48 BCE, Ptolemy's faction had forced Cleopatra into exile. She fled to Syria and began raising an army. Meanwhile, Rome's civil war spilled into Egypt. Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, chasing his rival Pompey, who had fled after losing a battle. Ptolemy's advisors, trying to curry favour with Caesar, murdered Pompey and presented his severed head as a gift. Caesar was reportedly disgusted. Murdering a Roman general, even a rival, was dishonourable. Cleopatra saw an opportunity. She needed Roman support to regain her throne. Caesar was in Alexandria and had the power to decide Egypt's fate, so she arranged a meeting, famously smuggling herself into the royal palace rolled up in a carpet, or possibly a linen sack. Accounts vary. The point was to get past Ptolemy's guards and reach Caesar directly. It worked. Caesar was charmed, intrigued, possibly seduced, though the romantic details are lost to history and later Roman propaganda. What's clear is that Caesar backed Cleopatra. He restored her to the throne, forcing Ptolemy to accept her as co-ruler. Ptolemy's advisors rebelled, and Caesar fought a brief but vicious war in Alexandria. The Library of Alexandria, or at least part of it, burned during the fighting, a tragedy of incalculable loss. Ptolemy drowned in the Nile while fleeing. Cleopatra was now sole ruler, though she dutifully married another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, to maintain appearances. Cleopatra and Caesar became lovers. She bore him a son, Caesarion, Little Caesar, whom she claimed was Caesar's heir. Caesar never officially acknowledged him, but he didn't deny it either. Cleopatra travelled to Rome, living in one of Caesar's villas, scandalizing Roman society. A foreign queen, an Egyptian, living openly as Caesar's mistress. Romans were appalled and fascinated in equal measure. Then Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE. Cleopatra fled back to Egypt. Her brother husband Ptolemy XIV conveniently died soon after, possibly poisoned, and she made Caesarion her co-ruler. She was playing for high stakes now. Her son by Caesar was a potential link to Roman power. Rome descended into another civil war. Mark Antony, one of Caesar's top generals, took control of the eastern Mediterranean. He summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus, modern-day Turkey, in 41 BCE. She arrived in spectacular fashion, sailing up the river in a golden barge with purple sails, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, surrounded by attendants dressed as nymphs. It was theatrical, calculated, and it worked. Antony was smitten. Their relationship became one of history's great romances, or great scandals, depending on your perspective. They were allies, lovers, partners, in an audacious plan to create a new power centre in the east to rival Rome itself. They had 3 children together. Antony married her despite already being married to Octavia, the sister of Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir. This was a massive insult and a political gift to Octavian, who used it to paint Antony as a traitor seduced by a foreign sorceress. Octavian declared war, not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra. The propaganda was vicious. She was a decadent Eastern queen, a manipulator who had enslaved a Roman general with her feminine wiles. The reality was more complex. Cleopatra was a skilled politician, a capable administrator, and a survivor in a brutal world. But Rome didn't want complexity. They wanted a villain. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, a naval engagement off the coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet faced Octavian's navy. The battle went badly. Cleopatra's ships withdrew, and Antony followed her. Whether this was retreat or a strategic move gone wrong is debated. Either way, it looked like abandonment. Antony's remaining forces surrendered. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Alexandria, Octavian pursued. When his forces arrived in 30 BCE, resistance was hopeless. Antony, falsely hearing that Cleopatra was dead, stabbed himself. He died in her arms. Cleopatra was captured. She tried to negotiate with Octavian, but he planned to take her to Rome as a prisoner, parade her in his triumph, a humiliating spectacle. She chose death instead. The exact method remains one of history's famous mysteries. The popular story says she used an asp, a venomous snake, smuggled into her chambers in a basket of figs. She let it bite her, dying relatively quickly and painlessly. Some ancient sources support this version. Others suggest she used a poisonous ointment or a hollow hairpin filled with toxin. The Romans claimed she had tested various poisons on condemned prisoners, experimenting to find the least painful death. Grim, but possibly true, Cleopatra was nothing if not thorough. On August 12, 30 BCE, Cleopatra died at age 39. Her 2 handmaidens died with her, whether by choice or because they'd helped and knew Octavian wouldn't spare them. Octavian allowed Cleopatra to be buried beside Antony, honouring her final request, though the location of their tomb has never been found. 3,000 years of pharaonic tradition ended with a Macedonian Greek queen choosing death over Roman captivity. Octavian had Caesarion killed. The boy was 17, Caesar's only biological son, and therefore a potential rival. The other 3 children, Cleopatra's offspring with Antony, were spared and sent to Rome to be raised by Octavian's sister Octavia. Egypt became a Roman province, the personal property of the emperor. The ancient temples continued functioning, priests still performed rituals, but the heart was gone. Egypt was no longer Egypt. It was Rome's breadbasket. With Cleopatra's death, the office of pharaoh ended. The divine kingship that had lasted since Nama unified the 2 lands was over. Egyptian gods and their stories. The ancient Egyptians didn't have one tidy religion with a single set of beliefs. They had thousands of years of accumulated gods, myths, and local traditions that contradicted each other, merged together and evolved constantly. Different cities had different patron deities. Different time periods emphasized different gods. The whole system was gloriously messy, which probably made it feel more alive than any neat organized theology ever could. At the top of the pantheon, or at least near it, sat Ra, the sun god. He travelled across the sky each day in his solar bark, a boat, because even gods apparently needed transportation. At night, he journeyed through the underworld, the Duat, fighting off demons and the great serpent Apophis, who tried to swallow him and prevent sunrise. Every dawn was a victory, the triumph of order over chaos. Egyptians worried that one day Apophis might win, so priests performed daily rituals to help Ra defeat the serpent. Anxiety about the sun not rising seems excessive, but religion thrives on cosmic stakes. Ra merged with other gods constantly. Ra-Horikot combined Ra with Horus, the falcon god. Amun-Ra merged Ra with Amun, the hidden one, the god of Thebes who became king of the gods during the New Kingdom. Egyptian theology was flexible like that. Gods could combine, separate, have multiple forms. It wasn't contradictory to them. It was just how divinity worked. Osiris was the god of the afterlife, and his myth is central to Egyptian religion. He was originally a king who ruled Egypt in a golden age, teaching humans agriculture and civilization. His brother Set was jealous. Set tricked Osiris into climbing into a beautiful coffin, then sealed it and threw it into the Nile. The coffin washed up in Byblos, in modern Lebanon, where a tree grew around it. Isis, Osiris's wife and sister, because Egyptian gods kept it complicated, searched everywhere and finally found him. She brought the body back to Egypt, but Set discovered it, furious that his murder had been undone. He tore Osiris's body into 14 pieces and scattered them across Egypt. Isis searched again, finding all the pieces except one, his phallus, which had been eaten by a fish. She magically fashioned a replacement, because when you're a goddess, anatomical problems are solvable. She reassembled Osiris, mummified him, and through magic briefly revived him long enough to conceive a son, Horus. Osiris couldn't return to the land of the living. He became lord of the underworld instead, ruler of the dead, judge of souls. Every pharaoh in death became Osiris, just as every living pharaoh was Horus. The myth explained death, resurrection, the afterlife, and royal succession all at once. Efficient. Hyrieus, the falcon-headed god, grew up hidden in the marshes while Set ruled Egypt. When Hyrieus came of age, he challenged Set for the throne. Their battles were legendary, vicious fights where Hyrieus lost an eye and Set lost his testicles. Egyptian myths didn't shy away from bodily violence. Eventually, the gods held a tribunal and awarded the throne to Horus. Order was restored. Set was cast out, becoming the god of chaos, storms, and foreigners. Later periods demonized Set completely, but originally he was more ambiguous, necessary chaos balanced against necessary order. Isis was one of the most important goddesses, the ideal mother and wife, a powerful magician. She protected children, helped women in childbirth, and was so clever she once tricked Ra into revealing his secret name, gaining power over him. Her cult spread far beyond Egypt, eventually reaching Rome, where temples to Isis appeared across the empire. She was the goddess who wouldn't stay contained by borders. Thoth, the ibis-headed god, was the deity of writing, knowledge, and magic. He invented hieroglyphs, recorded the judgment of souls, and mediated disputes between gods. Scribes worshipped him naturally. He was logical, balanced, the divine bureaucrat who kept the cosmos running smoothly. His sacred animal was the ibis, and also the baboon, because apparently he contained multitudes. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, presided over mummification and protected tombs. Jackals scavenged in cemeteries, so the Egyptians made them sacred. A deity who guarded the dead rather than desecrating them. Anubis guided souls through the underworld and oversaw the weighing of the heart, the judgment that determined whether the deceased could enter the afterlife. Hathor was the cow goddess, deity of love, music, joy, and drunkenness. She could also transform into Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of war and plague, when Ra sent her to punish humanity for rebellion. In that myth, Sekhmet became so bloodthirsty she nearly destroyed all humans until Ra tricked her by dyeing beer red to look like blood. She drank it, got drunk, transformed back into gentle Hathor, and humanity was saved. The Egyptians really understood that gods needed to contain contradictions, love and destruction, joy and rage, all in one deity. Bastet, another cat goddess, protected homes and families. Cats were sacred to her, and killing one even accidentally carried severe penalties. The Greeks reported that Egyptians would rush into burning buildings to save cats before people, which might be exaggeration, but maybe not. They really loved their cats. Maat wasn't just a goddess. She was a concept, truth, justice, cosmic order. She was depicted as a woman with an ostrich feather on her head, and that feather was weighed against the heart of the deceased in judgment. The gods were everywhere, in everything, countless and contradictory and utterly essential. Mummification and the afterlife. The Egyptians were obsessed with death. Not in a morbid way, but in a deeply practical one. They believed death was just a transition, a doorway to another existence. But getting through that doorway successfully required preparation. A lot of preparation. The body needed to be preserved, the soul needed supplies, and the deceased needed to know the right spells to navigate the dangers of the underworld. Failing any of these steps meant oblivion, true death, the end of existence, so they took it seriously. Mummification was the cornerstone of it all. The Egyptians observed that bodies buried in the hot, dry sand sometimes naturally desiccated, preserving skin and features. They turned this accident into an art form. The process took 70 days and was expensive, so elaborate mummification was mostly for the wealthy. Poor people got simpler versions, or just sand burial, but everyone wanted preservation if they could afford it. The process began shortly after death. The body was taken to the Pernifer, the house of mummification, usually a tent near the tomb or at the edge of the desert. Priests, specifically embalmers, performed the work. They wore masks of Anubis, the jackal god, becoming the deity while they worked. First they washed the body with palm wine and water from the Nile. Purification was essential. Next came the removal of internal organs. The brain was considered useless, just packing material in the skull. They inserted a long hook through the nostril, broke through the ethmoid bone, and pulled the brain out in pieces. Undignified but effective. The brain was discarded. No one missed it. The organs that mattered, the liver, lungs, stomach and intestines, were removed through an incision in the left side of the abdomen. These were preserved separately in canopic jars, 4 containers each protected by a different deity. The heart was left in place. The heart was crucial. It was the seat of intelligence, emotion and memory. The deceased would need it for judgment in the afterlife. The body cavity was cleaned, rinsed with wine and spices, then packed with natron, a natural salt mixture that desiccated tissue. The body was covered in natron too, inside and out. and left for 40 days. The natron drew out all moisture, preventing decay. After 40 days, the body was dried, leathery but preserved. Then came wrapping. The body was cleaned again, rubbed with oils and resins to keep the skin supple. Amulets were placed between layers of linen bandages, each with specific protective powers. The wrapping took days. Hundreds of yards of linen, each layer soaked in resin, the priests reciting spells as they worked. The body was transforming from corpse to sacred object. The wrapped mummy was placed in a coffin, often nested inside multiple coffins, each more elaborate than the last. The final container was a sarcophagus, sometimes stone, carved with protective texts and images of gods. The coffins were painted with the deceased's face, idealized and serene, eyes wide open to see in the afterlife. But preservation was only the beginning. The soul was complex in Egyptian belief. It had multiple parts: the Ka, the Ba, the Ach, the name, the shadow. The Ka was a spiritual double, created at birth, needing food and drink offerings to survive. The Ba was personality, depicted as a bird with a human head, free to move between the tomb and the world. The Ach was the transfigured spirit, what you became if everything went right. All these parts needed the body as an anchor. No body, no afterlife, hence the obsession with preservation. The tomb was stocked with everything needed for eternity: food, beer, clothing, furniture, tools, servants in the form of shabti figures, small statues that would magically come to life to do work in the afterlife. The wealthy included treasure, jewelry, games, anything that made life comfortable. The walls were painted with scenes of daily life, banquets, harvests, family, all magically available to the deceased forever. The journey to the afterlife was dangerous. The Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and instructions, guided the deceased through challenges. There were gates to pass, demons to avoid, passwords to speak. Each spell had a purpose: transforming into a bird to escape danger, avoiding walking upside down, not having your head cut off. The underworld was specific in its threats. The climax was the weighing of the heart. The deceased stood before Osiris and 42 divine judges. Anubis placed the heart on a scale, balanced against the feather of Martut, truth and justice. The deceased recited the negative confession, declaring all the sins they hadn't committed. I have not killed, I have not stolen, I have not lied, I have not been unkind. The heart was weighed. If the heart was light, balanced with Mut, the deceased was declared justified and could enter the field of reeds, a paradise that looked exactly like Egypt, but better. The Nile always flooded perfectly. Crops grew effortlessly. It was eternal life in an idealized version of home. If the heart was heavy with sin, Ammit the Devourer, a demon with the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippo waited beside the scales. She ate the heart. The soul ceased to exist. True death. Oblivion. Everything, the mummification, the tomb, the spells, the judgment, was designed to avoid that moment, to live forever. Hieroglyphs, the sacred writing. The ancient Egyptians called their writing system Medu Neter, words of the gods. The Greeks, centuries later, called them hieroglyphs, sacred carvings, because they mostly saw them on temple walls and monuments. The name stuck. But hieroglyphs weren't just sacred, they were also practical, used for everything from royal decrees to shopping lists. Though the shopping lists were usually written in simpler scripts because carving full hieroglyphs for 3 loaves of bread was overkill. The system emerged around 3200 BCE, roughly the same time writing appeared in Mesopotamia. Whether the Egyptians invented it independently or got the idea from contact with Sumerians is debated. Either way, they took the concept and made it uniquely their own. Hieroglyphs combined pictures, sounds, and meaning in a way that's both logical and maddeningly complex. There are 3 types of signs. Logograms are pictures that represent the thing they depict. A picture of a sun means sun. A picture of a house means house. Simple enough. But most words don't have obvious pictures, so the Egyptians got creative. They used phonograms, signs representing sounds rather than things. A picture of a mouth, R in Egyptian, could be used in any word with that sound. Combine several phonograms and you could spell out words phonetically. Then, because nothing in Egyptian could be straightforward, they added determinatives. These are signs placed at the end of words to clarify meaning. The word Saya could mean son or daughter depending on context, so they'd add a determinative showing a seated man or woman. A word about motion might have a pair of walking legs as a determinative. Reading hieroglyphs means understanding this three-layer system simultaneously. Pictures, sounds, and context clues all at once. Hieroglyphs could be written left to right, right to left, or top to bottom. How do you know which direction to read? Look at the animals and people. They face the beginning of the line. If a bird faces right, you read from the right. If it faces left, read from the left. The Egyptians liked symmetry, so on either side of a doorway, the hieroglyphs would mirror each other, creating visual balance even if it made reading slightly more complicated. Learning to write hieroglyphs took years. Boys, and it was mostly boys, entered scribal school around age 5. They spent years copying texts, memorizing signs, practicing on pottery shards and limestone flakes called ostraka because papyrus was expensive and you didn't waste it on students. The curriculum included classic literature like the Tale of Sinuhe, religious texts, and endless practice writing formulaic letters and administrative documents. Teachers were strict. Texts survive advising students to study hard or they'd end up doing manual labour, which was depicted as miserable. The scribe sits in the shade while others toil in the sun, one text boasts. Being a scribe meant status, security, and not having to plough fields. The motivation was clear. Learn your hieroglyphs or spend your life breaking your back. But hieroglyphs were slow to write, each sign carefully formed, beautiful but impractical for everyday use. So the Egyptians developed hieratic, a cursive form of hieroglyphs, faster to write with a reed brush on papyrus. Hieratic kept the same sounds and grammar, but simplified the signs into flowing script. Most documents, letters, accounts, literature were written in hieratic. Hieroglyphs were reserved for formal inscriptions, monuments, and religious texts. Later, during the late period, an even more simplified script appeared, demotic, the people's writing. Demotic was faster still, used for legal documents, business records, everyday correspondence. By Cleopatra's time, 3 scripts coexisted: hieroglyphs for temples and monuments, hieratic for religious texts, and demotic for everything else. You needed different literacy skills depending on your profession. The grammar was complex. Verbs changed depending on tense, mood, whether the action was completed or ongoing. Word order mattered but could be flexible for emphasis. There were singular, dual, and plural forms, masculine and feminine nouns. 3 grammatical genders. Learning to read was one thing. Learning to write grammatically correct hieroglyphs was another level entirely. Hieroglyphs also lacked vowels. They wrote consonants and left readers to supply the vowels from context and knowledge of the spoken language. This is why we're not entirely sure how ancient Egyptian sounded. We know the consonantal skeleton of words but can only guess at vowels. When Egyptologists pronounce ancient Egyptian today, they insert vowels to make words speakable, but it's educated guesswork. The actual pronunciation died with the last speakers. Coptic, the latest stage of the Egyptian language, was written in Greek letters with a few added characters for sounds Greek didn't have. Coptic preserved some information about how late Egyptian sounded, and scholars work backward from there, but the vowels of earlier stages remain mysterious. When you see a pharaoh's name written as Tutankhamun, that's an approximation, a convention. The ancient pronunciation is lost. Hieroglyphs were used for over 3,500 years, an extraordinary lifespan for any writing system. The last datable hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE at the Temple of Philae. After that, the knowledge faded. Christianity spread through Egypt, bringing Greek and Coptic as the written languages. The old scripts were associated with pagan religion. Priests who knew hieroglyphs died without teaching the next generation. By the medieval period, no one could read hieroglyphs. They'd become mysterious symbols, beautiful but incomprehensible. The ancient voices fell silent, until someone found the key. Daily life in ancient Egypt. While pharaohs built temples and priests performed elaborate rituals, most Egyptians lived simpler lives centered around work, family, and the changing seasons. Their world was small, bounded by the village, the fields, and the river. But within those boundaries, life had its rhythms, its pleasures, its struggles. The day began early before the heat became unbearable. Farmers rose at dawn and headed to the fields. Planting, weeding, irrigating, harvesting, the work depended on the season. During Akhet, the inundation when the fields were flooded, farmers worked on construction projects, building temples or tombs, fulfilling their labor obligations to the state. During Peret and Shemu, the growing and harvest seasons, they worked their plots from sunrise to sunset. Irrigation was constant work. The Nile's flood was generous but didn't reach everywhere evenly. Farmers dug channels, built small dikes, used shadoofs, simple lever devices with a bucket on one end and a counterweight on the other, to lift water from canals into higher fields. It was back-breaking labor, but necessary. No water, no crops, no food. The equation was simple and unforgiving. Tools were basic: wooden plows pulled by oxen, copper or bronze sickles for harvesting, hoes for breaking ground. Wealthy farmers had better equipment and draft animals. Poor farmers had their hands and backs. Farming technology didn't change much over 3,000 years. Why fix what works, especially when labor was plentiful and innovation expensive? After the harvest came threshing, separating grain from chaff. Oxen or donkeys were driven over the grain to crush the stalks. Then workers tossed it in the air with wooden forks, letting the wind blow away the chaff, while the heavier grain fell back down. Then came the tax collector, always the tax collector. Taxes were a percentage of the harvest, calculated by scribes who measured fields and estimated yields. Tax evasion was tempting but dangerous. The state didn't mess around. Failure to pay could result in beatings, confiscation of property, or forced labor. Reliefs showed tax collectors with sticks ensuring compliance. The government needed grain to feed workers, soldiers, priests, and bureaucrats. Everyone else came second. Craftsmen had different routines. Potters shaped clay on wheels, created storage jars, cooking pots, fine vessels for the wealthy. Weavers worked looms, producing linen in various qualities, from coarse fabric for workers to fine, nearly transparent cloth for nobles. Carpenters built furniture, boats, coffins. Metalworkers forged tools, weapons, and jewelry. Each craft had its specialists. Knowledge passed from father to son, techniques refined over generations. Many craftsmen worked in workshops attached to temples or palaces, producing goods for the state or wealthy patrons. They received rations, grain, beer, oil, occasionally meat. It was steady work, more secure than farming, less vulnerable to bad harvests or floods. But it also meant less independence, working to someone else's specifications, fulfilling quotas. Markets existed, though not like modern ones. Egypt didn't use coined money until very late during the Ptolemaic period. Earlier, the economy ran on barter and rations. Workers received grain, which they could trade for other goods. A fixed exchange rate existed. 1 deben of copper, a standard weight, equaled a certain amount of grain, oil, or beer. People calculated value in debens, even if no actual copper changed hands. It was virtual currency, an accounting system for tracking trades. Women managed households, which was no small task. They ground grain into flour, a tedious daily chore using stone hand mills. They baked bread in clay ovens. They brewed beer, a multi-day process of soaking barley, letting it ferment, straining it. They spun thread and wove cloth. They raised children, hauled water, maintained the home. Wealthy women had servants to do these tasks. Poor women did them all themselves, while also working in fields during harvest. Children helped from an early age. By 5 or 6, they were doing simple tasks, watching younger siblings, feeding animals, carrying water, weeding. Play existed, but childhood was short. By adolescence, children were doing adult work, learning trades, preparing for their own families. Entertainment was simple, but cherished. People played board games like Senet, told stories, sang songs. Music was important. Flutes, harps, drums, sistrums rattling at festivals. Dancing, often acrobatic and energetic, accompanied celebrations. Festivals tied to gods or the agricultural calendar broke the routine, offering feasts, processions, time off work, beer flowing freely. The wealthy had more leisure. They hunted in the desert marshes for birds and fish, not for food, but for sport. They hosted dinner parties with entertainment, musicians, dancers, elaborate dishes. Tomb paintings show these banquets, guests in fine linen with cones of perfumed fat on their heads that melted slowly, releasing scent throughout the evening. Whether these cones were real or artistic convention is debated. Egyptian art mixed reality and symbolism freely. Villages were tight-knit communities, everyone knew everyone. Privacy was minimal, houses sat close together, walls shared, conversations overheard, disputes were settled by local councils of elders, or if serious, taken to magistrates. Crime existed: theft, assault, adultery. Punishments ranged from beatings to mutilation to death, depending on severity. Life was hard by modern standards, but not without joy. People loved their families, took pride in their work, celebrated good harvests, mourned losses, gossiped about neighbours, worried about the future. They were human, living human lives, in a world that felt permanent and unchanging. Though, of course, nothing lasts forever. Women in ancient Egypt. Egyptian women had rights that would have shocked their contemporaries in other ancient civilizations. While women in Greece were mostly confined to the home and Roman women needed male guardians for legal matters, Egyptian women could own property, run businesses, initiate divorce, and inherit wealth on equal terms with men. This doesn't mean Egypt was a feminist paradise. It was still a patriarchal society, but within that system, women had surprising agency. A woman could own land and pass it to her children, male or female. She could buy and sell property without needing her husband's permission. She could make a will deciding who inherited her possessions after death. These weren't theoretical rights reserved for the elite. Legal documents from all social levels show women conducting business, making contracts, suing in court. A woman's economic independence was recognized and protected by law. Marriage was a practical arrangement, not a religious ceremony. Couples moved in together, sometimes with a written contract specifying property rights and divorce terms. The contract protected both parties, but especially the wife, ensuring she'd receive compensation if the husband divorced her or was unfaithful. Divorce could be initiated by either spouse. A woman who left her husband took her property with her, plus a settlement. A man who left his wife owed her a portion of shared assets. Women could work outside the home in various roles. Most were involved in textile production, spinning, weaving, making clothes. This was respectable work, sometimes done at home, sometimes in temple or palace workshops. Women also worked as servants, mourners, musicians, dancers, and midwives. A few became doctors, though male physicians outnumbered them. One woman, Pesachet, held the title Overseer of Female Physicians during the Old Kingdom, suggesting female doctors were common enough to need supervision. The highest positions for women were religious. Many served as priestesses, performing rituals in temples, particularly for goddesses like Hathor or Isis. These weren't minor roles. Priestesses of Hathor were influential, well-paid and respected. During certain periods, the position of God's wife of Amun, the highest religious office for women, carried enormous political and economic power. These women controlled vast temple estates and served as counterbalances to royal authority. But most women's lives centered on the home and family. They married young, often in their early teens, though men were usually older. They bore children, ideally many, because infant mortality was high and large families meant security. Childbirth was dangerous. Many women died in labor or from complications afterward. Prayers and amulets invoked goddesses like Tawapor, the hippo deity of childbirth, and Bez, the dwarf god who protected mothers and infants. Children were cherished. Both boys and girls were wanted, though sons carried the family name and performed funerary rituals for deceased parents, giving them slight preference. Still, daughters inherited equally and were loved and valued. Tomb inscriptions mention daughters with affection, and parents mourned dead daughters as deeply as dead sons. Motherhood was idealized. A good mother was nurturing, protective, wise. The goddess Isis, who protected and raised Horus against all threats, was the model. But women weren't defined solely by motherhood. Childless women weren't outcasts. Unmarried women could live independently if they had resources. The system had flexibility. Women's legal status was nearly equal to men's, but social expectations weren't. Men held most government positions, commanded armies, served as high priests, and dominated public life. Women who transgressed these boundaries were exceptional and often faced resistance. Female pharaohs like Hatshepsut had to justify their rule extensively, adopting male regalia and titles to fit the expected image of kingship. Beauty and appearance mattered, as they do in most societies. Both men and women wore makeup, green malachite or black coal eyeliner, not just for vanity but also to protect eyes from the sun and prevent infection. Women wore wigs, elaborate hairstyles, jewelry, perfumed oils. Looking good was part of maintaining mart, social order. Neglecting appearance suggested chaos, disorder, a failure to respect societal norms. Women's fashion changed over time. Old Kingdom women wore simple sheath dresses. By the New Kingdom, pleated gowns with elaborate draping became fashionable. Wealthy women owned fine linen so thin it was nearly transparent, dyed in expensive colours, adorned with beads and embroidery. Jewellery, necklaces, bracelets, anklets, earrings served as wealth storage and status display. Gold, turquoise, lapis lazuli, carnelian, precious materials shaped into beautiful objects that announced the wearer's prosperity. Women participated in festivals and public celebrations. They attended temple ceremonies, brought offerings, joined processions. They weren't secluded. Egyptian culture was more open than many ancient societies. Men and women socialized together at banquets, in markets, during festivals. Tomb paintings show couples sitting together, affectionate and equal in representation. Love poetry from ancient Egypt shows mutual desire. Men wrote about women they longed for. Women wrote about men they desired. The poetry is sensual, emotional, romantic. Both genders experienced and expressed love. Marriage might have been practical, but passion existed too. Still, life was harder for women in many ways. They had fewer educational opportunities. Most couldn't read or write. Scribal schools rarely accepted girls. Legal equality didn't mean social equality. A woman's reputation mattered more than a man's. Adultery by a wife was serious, grounds for divorce and social disgrace. A husband's adultery was less scandalous, though still technically grounds for divorce if the wife chose. Egyptian women navigated a society that gave them legal rights but limited their public roles, that valued them as mothers but didn't define them solely by motherhood, that allowed independence but expected conformity. They were individuals working within a system, some thriving, some struggling, all human, just like women everywhere, in every time. The temples of Karnak and Luxor. On the east bank of the Nile at Thebes, two massive temple complexes sit less than 2 miles apart, connected by an ancient processional avenue lined with sphinxes, Karnak and Luxor. These weren't just religious buildings, they were cities within cities, economic powerhouses, political centres and monuments to divine kingship that grew for over 2,000 years. Walking through them, even in ruins, is overwhelming. The scale defeats comprehension. Karnak is the larger of the two, the most massive religious complex ever built. It covers over 200 acres. The main temple, dedicated to Amun-Ra, sits at the heart, surrounded by smaller temples, chapels, pylons, courtyards and sacred lakes. Construction began in the Middle Kingdom around 2000 BCE and continued through the Ptolemaic period. Every pharaoh who ruled Thebes wanted to leave their mark, adding a pylon here, a colonnade there, obelisks, statues, inscriptions. The result is architectural chaos, layer upon layer, style upon style, a timeline in stone. The approach to Karnak passes through a series of massive pylons, ceremonial gateways with sloping walls that tower over visitors. Each pylon was built by a different pharaoh, each trying to outdo their predecessors. The first pylon, never quite finished, is the newest, built during the 30th dynasty. It's over 370 feet wide and nearly 150 feet tall. Walking through it feels like entering the realm of giants. Beyond the pylons lies the Great Hypostyle Hall, one of the most impressive architectural achievements in human history. It's a forest of columns, 134 massive pillars arranged in 16 rows. The central columns are 70 feet tall, their capitals wide enough to hold 50 standing people. The roof, now mostly gone, once covered over 50,000 square feet, supported entirely by these columns. Light filtered through stone lattice windows high above, creating an atmosphere of mystery and awe. Every surface is carved with hieroglyphs and images, kings presenting offerings to gods, battle scenes showing pharaohs defeating enemies, religious texts describing rituals. The columns are so densely decorated you could spend days reading them and not finish. Seti I began the hall, and Ramesses II completed it, naturally adding his name everywhere and claiming credit for the entire project. Ramesses was nothing if not consistent in his self-promotion. The temple complex included administrative buildings, workshops, storehouses, housing for priests and treasuries. Karnak wasn't just a temple. It was an economic empire. During the New Kingdom, the Temple of Amun owned vast estates, employed thousands, controlled trade routes, and wielded political power that rivaled the pharaohs. The High Priest of Amun was one of the most powerful people in Egypt, and at times powerful enough to challenge the throne itself. Daily rituals at Karnak were elaborate. At dawn, the High Priest entered the sanctuary, broke the seal on the inner chamber, opened the shrine, and greeted the god's statue. The statue was washed, dressed in fresh linens, anointed with oils, presented with food and drink. The god was treated like royalty because, well, he was. After the ritual, the shrine was sealed again until the next day. Priests performed these ceremonies every day for centuries, an unbroken chain of service. The sacred lake at Karnak provided water for rituals and purification. Priests bathed in it before entering the temple. Geese sacred to Ormun swam on its surface. Underground channels connected it to the Nile, ensuring the water stayed fresh and symbolically linking the temple to Egypt's lifeblood. 2 miles south, Luxor Temple sits closer to the Nile, elegant and more unified in design than sprawling Karnak. Amenhotep III built the core temple during the 18th dynasty, creating a masterpiece of proportions and harmony. Ramesses II later added a massive pylon entrance and a courtyard, because of course he did. Luxor Temple was dedicated to the rejuvenation of kingship. During the annual Opet festival, the most important religious celebration in Thebes, statues of Amun, his wife Mut, and their son Khonsu were carried in a grand procession from Karnak to Luxor. The gods travelled by river on sacred barks, boats carried by priests, accompanied by music, dancing, offerings, and thousands of spectators. The festival lasted weeks, a time of celebration, feasting, and renewal. Inside Luxor Temple, the pharaoh performed secret rituals with the gods, ceremonies meant to reaffirm divine kingship and ensure the cosmos remained balanced. The walls show these sacred moments. The pharaoh embraced by gods, crowned by deities, acknowledged as the rightful ruler of Egypt. The avenue connecting Karnak and Luxor, the Dromos, was lined with hundreds of sphinxes, guardians watching over the sacred path. Some had human heads, others had ram heads representing Amun. Sections of this avenue have been excavated and restored recently, revealing the processional route in all its glory. Both temples remained active long after pharaonic rule ended. Under the Ptolemies, under Rome, priests still performed rituals, though reduced and changed. Eventually Christianity arrived. Churches were built inside the temples, Christian symbols carved over pagan images. Then mosques. A mosque still sits inside Luxor Temple's courtyard, built centuries ago when the temple was buried under sand and the builders had no idea what lay beneath. Karnak and Luxor stand as monuments to devotion, ambition, and the human need to build something greater than ourselves. Something that touches eternity. Abu Simbel and Nubia. Far south of Thebes, past the cataracts where the Nile becomes wild and dangerous, lies Nubia. The ancient Egyptians called it Tarseti, the land of the bow, named for Nubia's famous archers. It was a land of gold, ebony, ivory, and gemstones, resources Egypt craved. It was also home to powerful kingdoms that sometimes rivaled Egypt itself. The relationship between Egypt and Nubia swung between cooperation and conquest, trade and war, cultural exchange and colonization. During the New Kingdom, Egypt controlled Nubia directly, establishing fortresses, towns, and temples to assert dominance and extract wealth. The most spectacular of these temples is Abu Simbel, carved into a sandstone cliff on the west bank of the Nile, deep in Nubian territory. Ramesses II built it. Naturally, around 1264 BCE, and it's possibly his most impressive monument, which is saying something for a man who never met a building project he couldn't make colossal. The temple facade is dominated by 4 seated statues of Ramesses, each about 67 feet tall, carved directly from the cliff face. They sit in eternal stillness, hands on knees, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, gazing east toward the rising sun. Between their legs and around their feet, smaller statues depict members of the royal family, his mother, his wife Nefertari, his children. They barely reach his knees. The scale is deliberately overwhelming, designed to intimidate anyone approaching. If you were a Nubian chief visiting this temple, the message was clear. Ramesses is a god, Egypt is eternal, resistance is futile. The entrance sits between the central two colossi. Above it, a niche holds a statue of Ra-Horakhti, the falcon-headed sun god. Flanking the entrance are carved prisoners, Nubians and Asiatics, bound and defeated, trampled beneath the pharaoh's symbolic authority. Subtle decorating choices. Inside, the temple cuts deep into the mountain. The first hall, the hyperstyle hall, is supported by 8 pillars, each fronted by a statue of Ramesses as Osiris, arms crossed, holding the crook and flail. The walls are covered with reliefs showing Ramesses in battle, specifically the Battle of Kadesh, because he wanted everyone, even Nubians hundreds of miles from that Syrian battlefield, to know about his greatest, most embellished military victory. Deeper chambers lead eventually to the sanctuary, the innermost room, where 4 statues sit side by side. Park, Amun-Ra, the deified Ramesses himself, and Ra-Horakhti. Yes, Ramesses placed his own statue among the gods. The ego was cosmic. But here's the remarkable thing. The temple was oriented so that twice a year, on February 21st and October 21st, the rising sun would shine through the entrance, down the long corridor, and illuminate 3 of the 4 statues in the sanctuary. Park, god of darkness and the underworld, remained in shadow. The other 3 were bathed in sunlight. The engineering required to achieve this, carving into a mountain and calculating solar angles precisely, is staggering. About 400 feet north of the Great Temple sits a smaller temple dedicated to Hathor and Nefertari. The facade has 6 standing colossi, 4 of Ramesses and 2 of Nefertari, all equal in size. This equality is extraordinary. Royal wives were usually depicted much smaller than the pharaoh, but here Nefertari stands as tall as Ramesses, honoured as his beloved, his partner. The dedication inscription reads, Ramesses the Second has made a temple, excavated in the mountain, of eternal workmanship, for the chief queen Nefertari, beloved of Mute, in Nubia, forever and ever. Nefertari, for whose sake the very sun does shine. Even allowing for the hyperbole pharaohs loved, it's a stunning tribute. Abu Simbel wasn't just religious, it was political theatre. It marked Egypt's southern border, a statement of control. Nubians travelling north would see it and understand Egyptian power. Egyptian officials stationed in Nubia would worship there, performing rituals that reinforced their cultural identity so far from home. The temple said, "We are here, we are strong, we are divine." For centuries, Abu Simbel stood in the desert, largely forgotten after pharaonic rule ended. Sand buried it up to the heads of the colossi. European explorers in the early 19th century rediscovered it, amazed. Then in the 1960s, a crisis emerged. Egypt was building the Aswan High Dam to control the Nile's floods and generate electricity. The dam would create Lake Nasser, a massive reservoir that would flood Abu Simbel and dozens of other Nubian monuments. The international community rallied. UNESCO organised an extraordinary rescue effort. Between 1964 and 1968, engineers cut the temples into blocks, over 1,000 pieces weighing up to 30 tons each, and reassembled them on higher ground, 200 feet above and 600 feet back from their original location. They even recreated the artificial mountain around them. The solar alignment was preserved, adjusted slightly to account for the Gregorian calendar. It was one of the greatest engineering achievements of the 20th century, saving one of the greatest engineering achievements of the 13th century BCE. The old Nubian villages weren't saved. They disappeared beneath the lake. Entire communities were relocated, their ancestral lands drowned. Progress had a cost. But Abu Simbel survived, still standing, still impressive, still delivering Ramesses' message across 33 centuries. Some egos really are eternal. The Rosetta Stone discovery. By the late 18th century, ancient Egypt was a mystery wrapped in sand. Travellers visited the ruins, marvelled at the monuments, sketched the strange symbols carved everywhere, but no one could read them. Hieroglyphs were beautiful, obviously meaningful, but completely incomprehensible. Scholars had theories, most of them wrong. Some thought hieroglyphs were purely symbolic, mystical signs representing concepts rather than language. Others believed each symbol was a complete word. No one understood that hieroglyphs were actually a writing system with grammar, phonetics, and structure like any other script. Then, in 1799, a French soldier was digging fortifications near the town of Rosetta, on the Mediterranean coast in the Nile Delta, when his shovel struck stone. He uncovered a dark granite slab about 3 feet 9 inches tall and 2 feet 4 inches wide, covered with inscriptions in 3 different scripts. The soldier, whose name was probably Pierre-François Bouchard, though accounts vary, recognized this was important and reported it to his officers. The stone contained the same text written 3 times, once in hieroglyphs at the top, once in Demotic script in the middle, and once in ancient Greek at the bottom. Anyone educated in the late 18th century could read ancient Greek. Finally, a way to unlock hieroglyphs. If the Greek text said the same thing as the hieroglyphs, you could use it as a translation key. The potential was immediately obvious. The French were in Egypt as part of Napoleon's campaign, an attempt to threaten British trade routes to India and, not coincidentally, claim some of the glory of ancient civilization for France. Napoleon brought scientists, scholars, and artists along with his army. They documented everything: monuments, plants, animals, customs, creating the multi-volume Description de l'Egypte that introduced Europe to Egyptian wonders in unprecedented detail. The Rosetta Stone was the expedition's greatest find, but the French military campaign failed. The British defeated Napoleon's fleet at the Battle of the Nile. By 1801, the French had to surrender Egypt. Under the terms of capitulation, the British seized French antiquities, including the Rosetta Stone. It was shipped to London and placed in the British Museum, where it remains today a point of ongoing diplomatic tension. Egypt wants it back. Britain says it's staying. Museums and colonialism have complicated relationships with ownership. Copies of the inscription were made and distributed to scholars across Europe. The race to decipher hieroglyphs began. The Greek text was straightforward. It was a decree issued in 196 BCE by priests honouring Ptolemy V. Standard stuff praising the king, listing his virtues, announcing tax exemptions for temples. The content wasn't exciting. What mattered was using it to crack the code. Early attempts focused on the wrong approach. British scholar Thomas Young made progress, identifying that some hieroglyphs represented sounds, particularly in the cartouches, the oval frames that enclosed royal names. He correctly identified some signs in Ptolemy's name, but he still thought most hieroglyphs were symbolic rather than phonetic. He was close, but couldn't make the final leap. The breakthrough came from Jean-François Champollion, a French linguist and scholar obsessed with ancient Egypt since childhood. He taught himself Coptic, the latest stage of the Egyptian language still used in Egyptian Christian liturgy. Champollion believed Coptic was the key to understanding ancient Egyptian, a controversial view at the time. He studied the Rosetta Stone copies for years, comparing the hieroglyphic and demotic text with the Greek. He focused on names, particularly Ptolemy and Cleopatra, which appeared in both Greek and hieroglyphs. By comparing the cartouches, he identified which hieroglyphs represented which sounds. On September 14, 1822, Champollion realized that hieroglyphs were a full phonetic writing system, not just for foreign names, but for Egyptian words too. The symbols could represent sounds, ideas, or both, used together in complex ways. He rushed to his brother's office, threw his papers on the desk, shouted, "Je tiens l'affaire, I've got it," and promptly fainted from excitement. Or so the story goes. Scholars love a dramatic moment, and this one might be embellished, but Champollion definitely had his breakthrough that September. He published his findings, Lettres Immerse d'Acier, in 1822, explaining the hieroglyphic system. It was revolutionary. Suddenly, 3,000 years of silent text could speak again. Temple walls, tomb inscriptions, papyri, stelae, all became readable. The voices of ancient Egyptians, the pharaohs, priests, scribes, poets, doctors returned after millennia of silence. Champollion spent the rest of his short life. He died at 41, studying and translating Egyptian texts. He visited Egypt in 1828, the first person in over 1,000 years who could read the monuments he saw. Imagine standing before Karnak's walls and understanding the inscriptions, seeing the names of pharaohs and gods not as mysterious symbols but as words, stories, history. He wept at temples, overwhelmed by the ability to hear the ancient voices. The Rosetta Stone unlocked an entire civilization. Without it, ancient Egypt would remain mysterious, approachable only through Greek and Roman accounts filtered through foreign perspectives. The stone let Egyptians speak for themselves, in their own words, their own language. One granite slab, found by accident, changed everything. Sometimes history turns on chance. Ancient Egypt's legacy. Ancient Egypt lasted over 3,000 years, longer than any other continuous civilization in human history. The distance in time from the building of the Great Pyramid to Cleopatra's death is greater than the distance from Cleopatra to us. Think about that. The pyramids were more ancient to the ancient Romans than Rome is to us. The sheer span is difficult to comprehend, and the influence of that civilization echoes through time in ways both obvious and subtle. The Greeks were fascinated by Egypt. They visited as tourists, studied with Egyptian priests, absorbed Egyptian knowledge, and borrowed Egyptian ideas. Greek philosophers, including Pythagoras and Plato, supposedly studied in Egypt, though how much is historical fact versus later legend is debatable. Still, the Greeks openly admitted they learned geometry, astronomy, and medicine from the Egyptians. They saw Egypt as the source of ancient wisdom, a civilization so old it touched the beginning of time itself. The Romans were equally impressed, but more pragmatic. They conquered Egypt, stripped it of wealth, and turned it into the empire's grain supply. But they also adopted Egyptian gods into their pantheon. The cult of Isis spread throughout the Roman Empire. Temples to Isis appeared in Rome, Pompeii, Londinium, even the far edges of Roman Britain. Isis became a universal mother goddess, absorbing elements from other traditions, evolving beyond her Egyptian origins, but carrying that heritage across the Mediterranean world. Egyptian art influenced Greek sculpture. The rigid frontal poses of archaic Greek statues, the stylized hair and proportions directly echo Egyptian conventions. Greek temples borrowed architectural elements, columns, capitals, processional approaches. The Greeks took Egyptian ideas and made them their own, transforming and refining them. But the debt was clear. Obelisks became symbols of imperial power. Roman emperors transported them from Egypt to Rome, displaying them as trophies and architectural ornaments. Today, more obelisks stand in Rome than in Egypt. They're everywhere. Paris, London, New York, Istanbul. Cleopatra's Needle in London has nothing to do with Cleopatra. It was carved over 1,000 years before her reign, but European fascination with Egypt attached her name anyway. These monuments were ripped from their original contexts and repurposed as symbols of Western civilization's connection to ancient glory. Christianity absorbed Egyptian influences too. Early Christian monasticism, the hermit tradition, developed in the Egyptian desert. The first Christian monks were Egyptian, following traditions of asceticism and desert spirituality that had roots in Pharaonic religious practices. Coptic Christianity, Egypt's indigenous form, preserved elements of ancient Egyptian culture within a Christian framework. The language survived in liturgy. Some scholars argue that images of Isis nursing Horus influenced later iconography of Mary and Jesus, the Divine Mother and Child. The parallels are striking, though how direct the connection is remains debated. The Islamic conquest in 641 CE brought Arabic and Islam to Egypt, transforming the culture fundamentally. Yet even Islamic Egypt preserved a sense of connection to the pharaonic past. Medieval Arab scholars studied the pyramids, speculated about their purpose, recorded measurements. Some thought they were granaries built by Joseph from the Bible. Others recognized them as tombs. The Arabic name for Egypt, Mizar, has ancient roots, possibly connected to the name Egyptians used for their own country. The Enlightenment saw a revival of European interest in Egypt, fascinated by the exotic and the ancient. Napoleon's expedition brought scientific documentation leading to the birth of Egyptology as a discipline. The 19th century saw treasure hunters and archaeologists, often indistinguishable from each other, excavating tombs, shipping artifacts to European museums, and sometimes destroying sites in their enthusiasm. Egypt became fashionable. Egyptian motifs appeared in architecture, furniture, jewelry. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 triggered an explosion of Egyptomania that influenced Art Deco design, Hollywood films, and popular culture. Modern Egypt inherited this complicated legacy. The nation gained independence in the 20th century, reclaiming its identity separate from colonial powers, but the ancient past remained contested. Who owns ancient Egypt? The modern Egyptian state? The international academic community? The museums that hold artifacts taken generations ago? The debates continue, passionate and unresolved. Egyptian contributions to human knowledge are foundational. They developed one of the first writing systems. They created monumental architecture that inspired imitation for millennia. They advanced medicine, mathematics, engineering, astronomy. Their concept of the afterlife influenced religious thought across cultures. They created art of extraordinary beauty and sophistication. They built a civilization that, despite invasions, occupations, and transformations, maintained cultural continuity for an almost unimaginable span. Walk into any major museum and you'll find an Egyptian gallery. The artifacts draw crowds. Children stare at mummies, fascinated and slightly horrified. Adults marvel at golden treasures. Everyone recognizes pyramids, sphinxes, hieroglyphs. Ancient Egypt is part of global cultural heritage, universally recognized symbols of human achievement and ambition. But it's important to remember that ancient Egypt wasn't static. It was 3,000 years of change, evolution, continuity and disruption. It was millions of individual lives, people who loved, struggled, created and died. It was farmers and scribes, priests and soldiers, kings and queens, all living in a world that felt as real and immediate to them as ours does to us. The monuments remain. The voices have been recovered. The story of ancient Egypt, told in stone and gold and fading papyrus, continues to speak across the centuries. And we're still listening. Good night.